A match struck off a boot heel, and a man in his own yard held a sheet of paper into the flame until 31 names went black in his hand. Nobody moved to stop him. Watch the ash go under his boot. Watch the woman standing 4 feet away who has every reason on this earth to be somewhere else, and isn't. Out on the road, a black coat rides toward this house at a walk. He isn't in a hurry. Men who already own the paper never are. 19 days. Somewhere would you treat them with kindness. In that valley there's a ledger with 2 columns that have never once agreed, and a preacher who can't look a woman in the eye, and a wagon due on the 12th with 83 names on the list. The wind comes down, off the fields carrying rain that will not fall. He's already reaching into his vest for something else. The wind came down off the Mesilla Flats that spring carrying dust and the promise of rain that would not fall for another 11 days. A man stood at the edge of a wheat field with a woman beside him. Green just breaking the crust of the soil. Neither of them talking. That was May of 1880, and by then everything had already happened. Go back 1 year. Go back to a morning when Jeremiah Holt had spoken maybe 10 sentences to that woman in his entire life, and every one of them had been about weather or road conditions or nothing at all, because a year before that nightness, a chief of the Chiricahua drove a buckboard into Jer Holt's yard with his daughter sitting straight back beside him, and asked a question that would take 384 days to finish answering. And a mile and a half east, in a grain office on Merchant Row, with the shutters half drawn against the heat, a man named Coleman Vance spread a survey map across his desk, smoothed it flat with the side of his hand, and let his finger rest on the middle parcel, the one with the year-round creek. His voice came easy, the way a man's does when he's said a thing to himself. So often it stopped being a hope and started being a schedule. By harvest, this whole basin signs my name. That map had 3 parcels shaded in red pencil. Holt's was the one in the center, and in the bottom drawer of a desk in a small office off a farmhouse kitchen, folded into quarters, softened at the creases from being taken out and put back too many times, there was a sheet of paper with 31 signatures on it. The 19th one read J. Holt. Nobody in that yard knew about the paper yet. That was the thing about April. Everybody was still standing in the part of it where they thought they knew what was happening. The buckboard came up the rut slow. Datso held the reins the way an older man does, when his hands have started arguing with him about it. Loose in the fingers, tight in the wrist. 58 years old. Trade blanket folded over one shoulder against a morning that hadn't warmed yet. Red cloth banded around his forehead, the way he'd worn it every day of his life and would not stop wearing it now. Not for this, not for anybody's comfort. His black felt hat sat on his knee. He'd learned that gesture from white men. He'd learned it the way you learn a foreign coin, by being handed it and told what it was worth. And he hated it, and he did it anyway, because this morning he was not a chief. This morning he was a father with 3 days of road behind him, and 1 door left to knock on. Ishton sat beside him and did not look at the house. 23 years old. Calico skirt, gone soft from washing. The blue flowers on it faded almost to gray. Cotton blouse buttoned to the throat. Tall, soft boots she'd ridden in, and would keep riding in. 6 years at the mission school at St. Ambrose had taught her to read, to write a clean hand, to add a column of figures faster than the man who set them down. It had not taught her what to do with her hands on a morning like this. So her hands found each other in front of her skirt and held on. Knuckles going pale. Jer Holt came out onto the porch steps with Marta's dish towel still hung over his shoulder from breakfast. He'd forgotten to set it down. He'd remember that detail for the rest of his life, and never once be able to explain why that was the piece that stuck. 31 years old. Stetson pushed back off his forehead. Collarless cotton shirt, brown wool vest, the red bandana at his throat, gone dark where the sweat had settled into it. 2 years since his father went into the ground. 2 years and 2 months since the woman he married did. He'd been up since 4. He'd known since Tuesday. Datso stopped the wagon and got down and did not offer a greeting. Have you thought this through? Not a question the way a question is shaped. He'd put it out flat. The way you set a stone down on a table between 2 men so they both have to look at it. Jer didn't answer straight off. His eyes went past the old man, went to the woman still sitting on the wagon seat, with her chin level and her hands locked together, and something crossed his face that wasn't doubt and wasn't resolve there. Something closer to a man checking a fence line before he leans on it. She dropped her gaze the second his met hers, which told him more than any words in the last week had told him. Because that was not shame. He'd seen shame. Shame slumped. That was a woman conserving something, holding a small remaining thing in reserve, out of the reach of the men standing around discussing what would be done with her. He took the dish towel off his shoulder finally, folded it once, held it. I accept. Datso studied him a moment longer, as though the two words on their own weren't proof of anything. And they weren't. Words were cheap all over the territory that year. Words had bought a good deal of land off people who couldn't read the papers underneath them. The old man's jaw worked. I don't ask you to love her. His hat still on his knee, still in his hand, still not on his head. Only that you never treat her poorly. I won't. Jer's voice came out level and flat and without any decoration on it at all. Not now. Not later. Nothing else passed between the two of them. Datso nodded once, set his hat back where it belonged, walked to the buckboard, and climbed up and turned the team without once looking back at his daughter. Except his shoulders didn't sit as straight going out as they had coming in, Jerry noticed. He filed it somewhere and did not take it out again for 8 months. And later, much later, when he understood what that old man had traded to hold himself upright for that long, Jer Holt would sit on a cold porch, with his breath showing and wish very badly that he'd said something. Anything, that he'd walked out and put a hand on the wagon rail. He didn't. Nobody does in the moment. That's the whole trouble with moments. Ishton climbed down from the seat by herself. Nobody had offered a hand, and she hadn't waited to see if one would come. Her boots hit the packed dirt and she stood there in the yard of a farm she had ridden past maybe a dozen times in her life, and never once thought about beyond noting where the water was. Now the water was hers. In some legal sense, she did not yet trust. Wind pulled a strand of hair loose against the red band. She didn't fix it. He led her toward the barn, and the whole household was already arranged there in the doorway like they'd been posted. Marta Boone, first, 54, wiping her hands on a white apron that had been white maybe twice in its working life. Brown wool skirt, hair scraped back under a kerchief knotted at the nape. She'd run that kitchen since before Jerry was tall enough to see over the work table. She'd buried his mother and his father and his wife, and had opinions about all 3 funerals that she'd never once spoken out loud. Amos Ketch behind her, 61, battered felt hat, flannel shirt, leather vest worn through at the pocket corners, suspenders, boots that had been resoled more times than they'd been polished, arms folded, jaw set. 30 years on this ground, nowhere else on this earth to go and no living family to go to it with. And Wes Tanner in the back, 19, hat too big for his head, jeans with the copper rivets he was proud of and mentioned too often, grinning like a boy told there was going to be a party and not yet informed what it cost. This is Ishton. That was all of it. No explanation. No story. No softening. Because he'd told them the night before, plainly, all 3 of them at the kitchen table with the lamp between them, and he was not going to make her stand in a barnyard and listen to it a second time. Marta stepped forward first, took the woman's hand in both of hers and held on a beat longer than politeness needed. Amos gave a short nod and said nothing at all. Wes opened his mouth, shut it again. Amos hadn't even looked at him. Amos had just angled his shoulder about 4 inches, and that had been enough. Which was, Ishton would learn, the entire way that man communicated. And then they went back to work, all 3, because there was a farm, and it was April, and the ground didn't care who'd gotten married. That was the first thing about the Holt place that she liked. Nobody was watching her. Down in Cañada Cruces that same hour, the grain office door stood open to catch whatever air was moving. Coleman Vance, 46, wore a black frock coat in a climate that punished a man for it, and he wore it because the punishment was the point. White shirt, hard collar, silk cravat, boots with a shine on them you could not get in that town without paying somebody to put it there weekly. In a valley where every man dressed to work, he dressed to be looked at by men who worked. He held 2 jobs, which was 1 job too many, and the territory had not noticed yet. He bought grain. And he signed the ration rolls for the agency out at Cañada, which meant he decided how much beef and how much flour and how many blankets went from the government to 83 Chiricahua, living on a strip of ground north of the Rincon. Both of those were legal. Holding both at once was the part nobody had thought hard about. The clerk brought him the territorial mail and Vance sorted it standing, thumb flicking the corners. Holt married her. He didn't look up when he said it. The clerk shifted. "This morning, they say. This morning." Vance set the mail down and smiled, which was worse than not smiling, and went back to the map. Because a woman married to a land-holding citizen before the removal order took effect in September was a woman who did not go on the list. That was the loophole. He'd known about it for 6 weeks. He'd assumed nobody else had, because assuming that was how he'd made every dollar he had. So the old chief had found a loophole. Fine. Vance ran his finger down the survey line to where the Rincon Creek crossed the Holt boundary and thought about how a note at a bank is just a piece of paper, and a piece of paper is just a thing that changes hands. Get me Hobart, Finn. Inside the house, with the door shut between them and the yard, Jer Holt spoke to her alone for the first time in his life. He didn't sit. Neither did she. This isn't a real marriage. Not the way people mean it. She waited. But it doesn't have to be an ugly one either. He turned his hat once in his hands and then made himself stop, because he'd noticed his father used to do that, and it had always looked like a man buying time. In this house, anything that concerns only you, your day, your time, your say in a thing, that's yours. I won't ask you to answer to me for it. Still nothing from her. So he kept going, 'cause the alternative was standing in his own front room in silence with a stranger. You didn't have a choice in this. I did, and it wasn't much of one either. So the least I can give you is that. Ishton nodded. She hadn't found her voice yet. When it came, it was barely over the sound of the wind working the shutter latch. You know what they say about me. Jera didn't move. About me and the man at the agency. Her chin stayed level. That was the thing that undid him a little. Later, when he thought back on it. She said it looking right at him. I'm not asking you to believe me. I've stopped asking people that. I only want one thing. Say it. Whatever happens between us. Don't let it be the reason you look at my father's people differently. And there it was. She had walked into a house she did not choose, married to a man she did not know, with the whole valley's opinion of her already printed and circulated, and the one thing she asked for was not for herself. Jer Holt stood in his own front room and understood, in about 4 seconds, that he had badly misjudged what kind of morning this was going to be. He was quiet long enough that she looked down, bracing. I can't promise I'll believe you right off. His voice came slower now, picking each word up and turning it over before he set it down. I don't know yet whether I will, but I can promise I'll treat you decently. That much I can give you today, and it won't change later. It wasn't the answer of a man making a vow. It was the answer of a man who did not make promises he wasn't certain he could keep. Which was, though Ishton had no way of knowing it that morning, the truest thing about him, and also the thing that would nearly cost him everything. He stopped at the door on his way out. Amos is a stubborn old man, plain-spoken past the point of manners, but there's no unkindness in him, whatever his face says. Don't let his words sit heavy with you. She almost said something, almost. He was already turning. Then he stopped again, one hand on the frame, and did not look back at her. One more thing. If you come across a cedar box in the desk drawer in the office, don't open it. And then he was gone, out toward the fields already, dark with the season's first turning, and Ishton stood alone in a stranger's front room, with the wind pulling at the shutter and a marriage license drying somewhere in a wagon on its way back to town. 3 days before that morning, Datso had driven the same road the other direction, alone, unsure how to begin. He'd found Jerry at the barn, mending a bridle, and for a while they'd talked about small things. The price of grain, a fence Jerry meant to move before summer, whether the Rincon would hold through August. 2 men circling. Datso let the silence go long, turned his hat once in his hands. I need something from you, Holt. Jer set the bridle down, wiped the oil off his fingers on the leg of his trousers. Bank trouble? I could speak to Finn if you needed a name to use. No. The old man looked at him directly. I need you to marry my daughter. Jerry went still in the particular way a man does when he's certain he has misheard. Datso did not make him ask twice. He laid it out flat. The removal order signed for September, moving the whole band south to San Carlos. The provision that exempted a woman lawfully married to a landholding citizen before the order took effect. The talk in town about his daughter started nobody could prove where and repeated everywhere. 6 months she'd clerked at the agency office, copying rolls, because she could write a fair hand and they paid in scrip. And then she'd quit. Sudden. In February. And within 3 weeks the valley had a story about why. He did not dress it up as more than it was. He did not pretend it was a small thing to ask. I have thought of no one else. Jera leaned back against the stall rail and did not say anything. I've watched you 2 years since your father died. Datso's voice didn't rise. It never rose. I watched you keep paying Marta and Amos and the boy through a lean season when a harder man would have turned all 3 out and slept fine. I watched you settle every account on Merchant Row before the due date, though it cost you sleep to do it. Twice I watched you say a thing in that town that made you no friends and hold to it anyway. The wind moved through the barn. If I must hand my daughter's name to a man, there is no man I trust with it more. And then he laid out what he could offer. Not much in coin. But there was a stretch of the upper Rincon that the band still held by agreement, and a right of passage across it for water that no white man in the valley had, and Datso would sign that over, which was worth more than money, and both of them knew it. And then, without being asked, he laid out the shape of the thing beyond the marriage itself. Jera would not be made to love a wife he hadn't chosen. Ishton would not be made to answer to a husband who held her circumstances over her. Separate rooms, until and unless she said otherwise. No hand laid on her without her word first. And after 3 years, if she wished to go, Jerry would not stand in her way. None of it went on paper. Datso did not offer a contract. Jerry did not ask for one. You have my word, then you have mine. Except he did not say yes. Not yet. He asked for 3 days to think, and the old man, who had not expected an answer standing there in a barn, gave it to him and drove home in the dark. Jer did not go back into the house after the buckboard cleared the gate. Would you treat them with kindness? He walked to the small room off the kitchen that served as an office, where the farm ledger sat open on the desk from that morning's reckoning, and he sat down and looked at the numbers as though they might have shifted since he last read them. They hadn't. The note at the Territorial Bank still wanted more than this year's crop was likely to bring. Even a good one, and this one wasn't going to be good, because he'd borrowed against expanded acreage a year ago, on a price that had already started coming down before the ink dried. Amos hadn't mentioned the note in weeks, which was its own kind of mentioning it. Wes still didn't know how close the whole thing stood, because Wes was 19, and had asked exactly 0 questions in 6 years about what would become of him if this place went under. On account of some part of him had never permitted himself to wonder. Marta knew. Marta generally did. She'd never once let on she was worried, which was precisely how Jerry could tell. He was not thinking, sitting there, about whether he could come to love a woman he had exchanged perhaps a dozen words with. That question sat too far out to have any weight. It was like asking a man in a river what he plans to plant. He was thinking about Amos Ketch, 61 years old, 3 decades on this ground, no wife left living and no children ever, who would be pointed at the road with a bedroll and $40 if the bank came, and who would go without one word of complaint, and who would be dead inside 2 winters. About Marta, who had run this kitchen since before he could reach the table, and who had exactly one other family in the world, and it was the one currently on the wrong side of a ledger line. About Wes, 13 when Jerry took him on and 19 now, who'd never asked, because that was the arithmetic, not romance, not duty, not even the farm particularly. 3 people. He shut the ledger. He didn't need 3 days. But he let the old man believe it had taken thought, because there is a kind of cruelty in showing a father how quickly you decided about his daughter. The thinking had mostly already been done anyway, in 100 small reckonings over the past year, each one adding toward exactly this kind of morning without him quite noticing until it arrived on his porch, wearing a black hat it refused to put on. And so, on the last morning of April, with the fields behind him only just turned, Jeremiah Holt stood on his own steps and heard a man he respected ask him a question he had answered 3 days earlier. Have you thought this through? He had. That was the truth of it, even if nobody standing in that yard yet knew how long he'd been thinking, or what exactly had been on the scale when he finally did. The reverend from the Presbyterian church at Cañada Crucis would not come out, on account of a schedule that had turned out to be unexpectedly full that week. So it was Ambrose Tull, who rode out from the mission station in the afternoon with the license and the book, 60 years old, dust on his coat, and something in his manner that Ishton noticed and could not name. He had taught her to read. 6 years. He had put the first primer in her hands when she was 11, and he had corrected her letters until her hand came out better than his own, and he had told her once that a person who can read cannot be made small. And now he stood in Jer Holt's front room and would not quite look at her. The ceremony took under 10 minutes. Marta and Amos stood witness. Wes hovered by the door with his hat in both hands because he could not think of anywhere else to put them, and had already tried 3 places. There were no flowers. There was no supper after. There was nothing about it that Ishton would ever afterward call a wedding except the license itself, and the new name written across the bottom of it when it was done. She signed it herself. Her hand was better than his. Tull's voice caught twice, both times in places where nothing in the words called for it, and he closed the book fast at the end, and he said something about the road and the light, and he was gone inside of a quarter hour, and Ishton stood there, looking at the door he'd gone out of, and thought, without being able to explain it, that a man who is only tired does not leave that fast. The horse came into the yard 20 minutes later. They heard it before they saw it, and Marta's hands stopped on the table, and Amos moved so that he was between the door and the room, which he did without appearing to have done anything at all. Coleman Vance did not get down. He sat his horse in the yard in a black frock coat with the dust already ruining it, and he took off his narrow-brimmed hat with a courtesy so complete it curdled. I came to offer congratulations. Jerry stepped out onto the porch. Did not come down the steps. Obliged. A man in your position. Vance let his eyes go over the house, the barn, the fields, and back. Pricing. Making an arrangement like this, it shows a considerable practicality. I admire it, Mr. Vance, because I'll tell you what I said to Hobart Finn not 2 hours ago. The hat went back on. Adjusted. I said, there is a man who understands that this valley is going to belong to whoever's still standing on it when the railroad comes. And I said he'll do what he has to. Ishton had come to the doorway. She should not have. She knew it while she was doing it, and she did it anyway, because she had spent February through April letting people say things about her behind doors, and she had reached the end of what she could stand of that. Vance saw her, and his face did not change, which was the thing that made it obscene, and he spoke to Jerry and looked at her. You've married the thing I was finished with, Holt. The yard went very quiet. Wes made a sound. Amos put a hand on his arm without turning his head. Jer Holt did not answer. He reached into his vest pocket and took out the folded marriage license, the ink on it not yet a full day old, and he opened it, and he looked at it a moment, and then he folded it again along the same creases and put it back in his pocket, and he walked down the steps past the horse and opened the gate. Held it. Roads that way. Vance sat there, because he had come out here expecting a reaction and had gotten a gate held open for him, and there is no version of a man that survives that gracefully. He rode out, and Jer stood at the gate with his hand on the post until the dust settled, and then he came back up and did not look at anyone, and went out to the fields with 3 hours of daylight left and worked every one of them. That night Ishton did not sleep. The east room had a bed and a chair and a window that faced wrong. The house made noises she didn't know. Every settling board sounded like a footstep because every board in a strange house does, and around 2 in the morning she heard a real one. slow, along the hall, past her door, not stopping, down toward the front room and then along silence and then back a good while later. She lay with her eyes open until the gray came. In the morning she asked Marta. Marta was working a bowl of dough with her sleeves shoved past the elbows and she didn't stop working it, but her hands went slower. He walks. Every night? Most. The dough turned, folded, turned, some worse than others. Ishton waited. And Marta Boone, 54 years old, who had never in her life gossiped about that family to anyone, and would not have started now, except that this woman was going to be living inside it, and deserved not to be blind, wiped her hands and sat down at the table and told her, Ada. The name landed in the kitchen like something set down heavy. 2 winters back. February, the bad one. The one that shut the Jornada Road 11 days. She'd taken lung fever. It came on fast the way it does at that altitude, and it went from a cough on to something else entirely by Wednesday night. And Jerry had saddled up in the dark with the snow coming sideways and ridden for Dr. Pryor at the Rio Puerco crossing. 19 miles. He got there. That was the part Marta wanted her to understand. He got there, and he got the doctor, and the two of them kindness. And the two of them started back and the storm turned and closed the crossing behind them and they spent 2 days in a line shack with a stove and no wood left. And when Jer Holt finally came up that road and saw the house with the lamps lit in every window at 10 in the morning, he knew before he got off the horse. He didn't fail. Marta's voice had gone flat and careful. He rode 19 miles in a storm that killed 2 men in this county that same week and he came back with the doctor. There is not one thing he could have done different. But he wasn't here. Marta looked at the window. And there's no arguing a man out of that. I've watched people try. His father tried, right up until his heart quit on him 4 months later, and I've always half thought that was the arguing that did it. Ishton sat with that. He doesn't speak of that winter. Marta got up and went back to the dough, because sitting still with it was worse. Not because he's forgotten it. Because he's still in it. And Ishton understood, right then, in a strange kitchen at 7 in the morning, exactly why a man would stand in his own front room and refuse to promise a stranger anything except decent treatment. Because he had promised once, and he had ridden 19 miles into a storm to keep it, and it had not been enough, and he had come back and learned that the world does not grade a man on effort. So he had stopped promising. She found the box 11 days later. She was not looking for it. That mattered to her afterward, and it mattered to nobody else at all. She was looking for a pen. The office off the kitchen was 8 feet by 10, with 1 window and a desk that had been her husband's father's, and the ledger lay on it open to a page that had made her wince in passing twice already. Figures crossed out and rewritten in the margins. Receipts folded loose between pages instead of copied in. A column that ran to the bottom of the sheet and then continued, for no reason on this earth, sideways. She'd been in that room maybe 4 times. She opened the bottom drawer because the top 2 didn't have a pen in them. Cedar. Plain box hinged, about the size of a family Bible, with a lid that didn't quite sit true. And she thought about the door frame and his hand on it and his back to her. Don't open it. And she thought about how a man who says that is telling you the location of the only thing in the house that matters. She opened it. A horn comb. A pair of women's gloves, kid leather, worn through at the right thumb. And underneath those, folded into quarters, the creases gone furry from handling. A sheet of foolscap with 2 columns of signatures down the bottom third. She read the heading. She read it again, slower, the way you do when your eyes have gone ahead of your understanding, and you have to send them back to His Excellency, the Governor of the Territory of New Mexico. The undersigned freeholders of the Mozilla Valley respectfully represent that the continued presence of the Chiricahua band upon lands adjacent to the settled portion of this valley is incompatible with the security of persons and property, and do humbly pray for their removal to a reservation more distant. Dated the 9th of October, 1877. 31 names. Her thumb went down the column. 19th. J. Holt. Ishton stood in that small room with the paper in her hand and the window light falling across it and did not move for a long time. Because she had been married 11 days to a man who had signed a petition to drive her father off his ground. Because he had saved her from an order he had helped call down. Because he had known this paper was in that drawer while he stood in his front room and told her that anything concerning only her was hers to decide. And her hands started to shake, and she let them. And then she folded the paper along its own creases and walked out through the kitchen past Marta, without a word, and out the door and into the yard. Amos was at the water trough with a bucket. Wes was up on the corral rail doing nothing that could be called work. Jer was crossing from the barn with a coil of wire over his shoulder. She stopped in the middle of the yard and held the paper up. "You saved me from the order you helped write." Wes came off the rail. Amos set the bucket down and did not pick it back up. Jer stopped where he was, looked at her hand, looked at what was in it, and he did not reach for it and he did not look away, and the thing that happened in his face was not surprise. That was the worst part. He wasn't surprised. "I signed it. I can read. I know you signed it. I'm asking you to tell me why." He took the wire off his shoulder and set it down slow. 3 weeks after I buried my wife. That's not a reason. No. His voice didn't rise. She would learn that his voice never rose and that it was not a mercy. It's a date. You ask me why, I'm getting there. It's a thing I've only said out loud once, and I said it to a fence post. Amos turned and started for the barn. "Stay put, Amos." The old man stopped. Holt stood in his own yard, in front of every person who lived on his land, and said it. That winter, there was talk that the Jornada Road got shut because of stock thieving up on the high ground. That riders had been pulling wire and pushing horses through the pass, and that's why the road crews turned back early. It wasn't true. I know now it wasn't true. The road shut because 11 inches of snow fell in a country that gets 3. He stopped. But somebody told me it was true, and I believed it, because I needed it to be somebody's fault besides mine. The wind came across the yard, and nobody said anything. I had a wife dead in the ground, and a father who couldn't look at me, and I had ridden as hard as a man can ride, and it hadn't counted for anything, and a man came to me with a piece of paper that said all of that had a cause, and the cause was your father's people, and I signed it. In October, on a Tuesday, standing up, in about 4 seconds. Ishton's throat had closed. I knew inside a year it was a lie. Then why is it still in your house? And that was the question. That was the whole thing, and she'd found the middle of it without meaning to. And Holt looked at his own dirt for a while before he answered. Because burning it would be easy. He raised his eyes. I keep it where I have to open that drawer to get at the accounts, so that 4 or 5 times a week I have to remember what kind of man I was in October of 77. If I burn it, then in 10 years I'm a man who was always fair to your father's people. And that would be a comfortable thing to be, and it would be a lie, and I've had about all the comfortable lies I can hold. Ishton stood there with the paper in her fist. She did not forgive him. She wanted that clear, later, when people got the story wrong and made it into something warm. She did not forgive him in that yard. Something in her had gone cold and stayed cold for a good while after. But she asked one more question, and it was the question that changed everything, though nobody standing there knew it yet. Who brought it to you? Jer's jaw moved. Vance. The word went across that yard like a stone through window glass. Amos Ketch picked his bucket back up, then set it down again. Because Amos had been standing at the edge of this for 11 days, keeping his mouth shut about a woman he hadn't decided on yet, and now there was something on the table that wasn't about her at all, and he had 30 years of standing on this ground and a right to speak on it. How many names on that thing? Ishton looked down. 31. Read them. She did. Out loud, in the yard, in the mission school English that Ambrose Tull had spent 6 years putting into her mouth. 31 names of men who owned land in the Mesilla Valley in October of 1877. Amos listened to all of them. Then he spat in the dirt. Boy. He was looking at Jer, and he had not called him boy in 9 years. You own the smallest piece of ground on that list, bar none. Kittredge has 4 times your acres. Old Ansel Pike had 6 times, so you tell me something. He waited. Why'd a man like Coleman Vance ride out here in October to get your name in particular? and Jer Holt stood in the middle of his own yard with the wire coil at his feet and no answer at all. Because he had never asked, "Would you treat them with kindness?" Because in October of 1877 he had been a man 3 weeks into the worst thing that would ever happen to him, and a well-dressed fellow had come out with a paper and a sympathetic face, and the question of why that fellow had bothered had simply never surfaced. It surfaced now. It surfaced in front of everybody, in daylight, and it did not go back down. Wes said something about needing to see to the mare, and nobody answered him, and he went. Marta had come out onto the porch at some point and had not come further. Amos picked up his bucket the third time and carried it into the barn, and that was all he had to say on the subject for the next 2 months. And Ishton stood in the yard with the paper in her hand and her husband 10 feet away, and understood that she had 2 choices, and they were both bad. She could ride out. She could ride the 22 miles back to her father's camp and stand in front of a dying old man, though she did not know yet that he was dying, and tell him she was going on the September list after all, which was not a choice. That was just the shape of a wall. Or she could stay in a house with a man who had signed his name against her people, and then kept the proof of it in a drawer for 18 months so he'd have to keep looking at it. Nobody in the territory would have blamed her for the first one. She went into the house. Marta stepped back from the door to let her by and did not ask a single question. Ishton walked through the kitchen and into the small office and put the paper back in the cedar box and closed the lid and shut the drawer. Squarely, all the way. And then she came back out into the kitchen and stood there a moment. There was a bowl of dough on the table gone overproofed, while everybody was outside, arguing, sag in the middle, pass saving, and Marta was looking at it and had not yet decided out loud what to do about it. Ishton took the second apron off the peg by the door, put it on, tied it behind her. The oven runs hotter on the left. Marta's hands went still. It does. Then we'll set the pan right of center and turn it once. And Marta Boone, who had been in that kitchen 31 years, and had watched a great deal come and go through it, looked at this woman for a long moment and then reached past her for the flour without one word, which in that house was the highest thing a person could be handed. That was the first decision Ishton made inside those walls. Not a reaction. A decision. She would make a great many more, and one of them would eventually put Coleman Vance on a horse headed for Santa Fe with a federal marshal riding behind him. But that came later, and it came hard. Out in the barn, Amos Ketch set his bucket on the bench and stood with both hands on the rail of the stall and did not move for a long while. Would you treat them with kindness? Because he had been on this place since Jerry's father bought it, and he had watched that particular business from distance and thought it was grief and would pass. And now he was standing in a barn doing arithmetic he did not like. Coleman Vance rode out here in October of 1877 for a signature he did not need from the smallest landholder on the list. 3 weeks after that landholder's wife went in the ground, which meant Vance had not wanted the signature. He had wanted Jerry Holt's name attached to a thing. And Amos Ketch, 61, with a reading level that stopped somewhere around a feed invoice, could not have told you what that thing was worth or how it would be used. Would you treat them with kindness? But he'd bought and sold enough stock in his life to know the sound of a man buying something cheap off somebody who was hurting. He came out of the barn at dusk and found Jer on the porch with a pipe he wasn't smoking. Amos didn't sit. You'll want to know where that note of yours is. Jer looked up. The bank note. On the acreage. It's at the territorial. With Finn. Is it? And Amos Ketch went on to the bunkhouse and left hanging in the air behind him, which was the longest speech he'd made all year and the cruelest, and he knew it, and he did it anyway, because there are things a man is owed even when he has not asked. Jer sat on that porch until the last light went off the organ range. Inside, through the window, he could hear the kitchen. 2 women's voices, not talking much. A pan going into an oven. Wes coming in and being told to wash and going back out. He thought about a paper in a coat. He thought about a paper in a drawer. He thought about a man in a black coat holding a hat over him this yard. And he thought about the fact that he had been standing at the middle of something for 18 months and had mistaken it for the edge. Ishton came out at full dark with a cup and set it on the rail beside him and did not sit down and did not say anything. She was at the door before he spoke. I'm not going to ask you to forget what you read today. She stopped with her hand on the frame. Good. Her voice came steady, and there was more resolve in it than warmth. Because I'm not going to. The door shut, and Jeremiah Holt sat on his own porch with a cup of coffee he had not asked for, brought out by a woman who had every reason on God's earth to have poured it in the yard instead, and understood that whatever he thought this arrangement was going to be, he had been wrong about that too. Out past the fence line, the fields lay dark with the season's first planting. Wheat already in the ground. Neither of them had chosen the ground, and there was no way yet to know what either one would grow into. But at the mission station 11 miles south, in a room with one lamp, Ambrose Tull sat with the marriage register open in front of him and his pen dry in his hand, and he was not writing. He had entered the union of Jeremiah Holt and the woman called Ishton on the 11th line of the page. Above it, on the 4th line, in his own hand, dated October of 1877, was a certification he had signed for a petition he had never once read all the way through. He'd signed it because Coleman Vance held the note on the mission chapel. He'd signed it, and then he had gone on standing in front of people every Sunday for 18 months telling them to do the right thing. Tull put the pen down. Then he closed the register and put it back on the shelf, and blew out the lamp, and did not sleep either. Would you treat them with kindness? Because there were 3 people in the Mesilla Valley that night who could not sleep on account of the same piece of paper, and only one of them had actually read it. Elias Thatcher came down from Prescott on the 10th day, which told Hannah more about the letter Gideon Ward had written than anything Gideon Ward would ever say about it. He was a small man, 48 years old, black professional suit, brushed clean of 4 days of road dust, steel-rimmed spectacles he took off and put on with a precision that suggested the gesture was doing some of his thinking for him. He carried "Treat them with kindness," a leather case, and he set it down on the floor beside his chair rather than on any table, which Hannah noticed, and which she came to understand meant that no table in a room was ever going to be more important to Elias Thatcher than the papers on it. He took the ledger, and then he did not speak for 40 minutes. They sat in his rented office above the way station on the main road in Dry Fork, which had 1 window and 2 chairs, and a rented desk with a burn ring on it, and Thatcher read Amos Mercer's handwriting the way a man reads a score, line by line, turning back, turning forward again. Once he stopped and held a page up sideways to the window light and studied the ink from an angle, and then set it down and went on. Hannah sat across from him with her hands in her lap and did not fidget. Gideon stood by the door with his hat in his hand and did not sit at all. Thatcher turned the last page, went back, read the entry once more. Then he took his spectacles off. Do you have other samples of your father's hand? 20 years of these. Hannah did not have to think about it. Letters he wrote my mother before they married, tied in the trunk. A promissory note he signed in Tucson in '69 for the purchase of a bull. Tax receipts, some of them. He kept everything, and I kept everything he kept. Thatcher's head came up. You have all of that. I have all of it. Why? Because it was his, she almost said, which was the true answer, and also the small one. Because I didn't know which piece would matter. Thatcher looked at her for a moment, with an expression she could not immediately place, and later understood, was the look of a man who has practiced 22 years, and has just been handed something uncommon. He put the spectacles back on. Miss Mercer, do you know what this is? Tell me what it is. She wanted to hear say it. She had wanted to hear somebody say it since she was 20 years old. It is a contemporaneous record. He tapped the page once, lightly, the way you touch a horse to let it know your hand is coming. Made at the time of the transaction, in the hand of the borrower, stating in plain language that no land was pledged. It is dated. It sits inside a continuous series of entries going back 19 years, which establishes it as a working book rather than a document assembled afterward to serve a purpose. He let that settle. Thorne's claim rests on paper he produced after your father was in the ground. A judge who sees both, We'll have to choose between a dead man's careful book and a living man's convenient one. Hannah's breath went out of her slowly, except then Thatcher turned the ledger over and opened it at the back and put his thumb into the gap near the spine. And his face changed. I found it 11 days ago. Who cut it? I don't know. When? I don't know that either. Hannah's jaw tightened. The paper's aged the same as the rest. It's not new. Thatcher took his spectacles off again, and this time it was not thinking. It was bracing. Then I have to tell you the bad part, and I would rather tell you now than in a courtroom. He set the book down flat. Opposing counsel will not argue that your father lied. He will not have to. He will argue that this book has been interfered with, because it has. Because there are pages missing from it, and neither of us can say who took them or why. The room was very small and very quiet, and the way station scale clanked once, below, through the floorboards. A book with a knife in its spine is a book a man can put doubt on, Thatcher said. And doubt is the only crop that grows in a courtroom without rain. Hannah looked at the gap. 6 years she had carried it. 6 years, and the one thing that could sink her had been riding under her arm the whole time, and she had never once turned to the back. How long until court? The territorial bench in Tucson hears land matters quarterly. Thatcher was already pulling paper from the leather case. Next session is 8 weeks out. I can have this on the docket. 8 weeks. 8 weeks. And I will not pretend that is a comfortable interval. He uncapped his ink. In 8 weeks, a man like Silas Thorne can do a great deal of arranging. Hannah stood up. File it. Thatcher's eyes went past her to the door. To Gideon, which was reflex. Would you treat them with kindness, which was 22 years of practice in a territory where a woman's business generally came with a man's signature attached to it. Gideon Ward did not move off the doorframe. Miss Mercer's the complainant. His voice was flat and entirely without emphasis, which somehow made it heavier. She doesn't need my say-so. Thatcher looked back at Hannah. He dipped the pen. Filed. Hannah walked out onto the boardwalk afterward and stood there in the noon heat, with her hands loose at her sides and the whole main road of Dry Fork going about its Tuesday in front of her. Filed. Which was a word she had not been able to say for 6 years, and which she had just watched a man write down. She did not feel triumphant. She felt something more precarious. Like a person who has finally set a heavy thing on a shelf and now has to stand under the shelf. Ellen Tuttle came out of the laundry with her sleeves pushed up and her forearms red to the elbow, and she crossed the road with the direct energy of a woman working against a schedule, and she took Hannah's hands in her wet ones without asking. You've got a minute. I've got the wagon at the livery. Then you've got a minute. Ellen Tuttle was 45, and she had run that laundry alone for 11 years, and she had been decent to the Mercer girls since before decent was a popular position, in the plain, unsentimental way of a woman with too much work to spare any time for cruelty. She pulled Hannah into the shade of the awning. People are talking. Hannah did not pretend to be surprised. About what? About you and Ward. Go on. They're saying you went up there to trap him. Ellen said it fast, the way you pull a splinter. That, after what he did at the market, you saw an opening and you took it. That a woman with nothing don't get a room and a wage out of the twin post on account of her biscuits. Hannah stood very still under the awning. She had known it was coming. She had known it with the certainty of a person who has lived in a town of 340 souls long enough to understand the mechanics of the thing, because she had gone from invisible to visible in the space of one Saturday morning. And visibility in Dry Fork had never once been a shelter. It was a mark. What do you think? Ellen did not even blink. I think you bake the best bread in this county, and you needed a steady situation, and you took an honest job. And I think folks with too much time on their hands will always find something to do with it. Hannah's throat did something inconvenient. Thank you. I'm not telling you to be careful. Ellen let go of her hands and wiped her own on her apron. You've been careful since you were 20 years old. I'm telling you so you're not surprised when it gets worse. Will it get worse? Hannah. Ellen looked at her with a kind of tired affection. You just walked out of a lawyer's office in the middle of the day where anybody could see you go in. Hannah rode back up the valley road in the late afternoon with the light going long and gold across the pinaleños and turning the whole slope the color of a good copper pot. She thought about being a topic. She thought about the particular arithmetic of a small town, where a woman with nothing is beneath notice, and a woman with a wage is a question, and a woman with a wage and a lawyer is a story. She thought about what they were building out of her, and she thought, with a flat clarity that surprised her, that she had not come to the Twin Post for Gideon Ward. She had come because she had been offered fair wages for honest work by a man who asked what her terms were, and because the alternative was another winter in a rented room above a feed store watching her own life contract by an inch a season until there was nothing left of it but a needle and a lamp. That was true. Except she had also noticed things. She had noticed that he treated every living thing on that property with the same even courtesy. The hands, the horses, the dog, Cassie her. She had noticed that when Hobbs came in 3 days running with his hand wrapped and would not say why, Gideon reassigned him to the tack shed for a week without ever once making him admit anything. She had noticed the way he stood at the corral fence in the evening, not managing the horses, not counting them, just looking at them. The way a man looks at a thing he genuinely likes and does not have to justify liking. She had noticed the page turning in the next room, and she had noticed that she had begun timing her kitchen work without deciding to, so that the last of it fell in the quiet hour when that sound was there. She told herself she was cataloging, practically, analytically, because understanding the people in a place is how a person does the job well. She was almost convincing. The trouble came up the valley road on a Thursday afternoon in a good spring wagon with a hired driver. Hannah was hanging wash in the side yard when she heard it. Not the pace this time. The quality. Visitors to the Twin Post were not unusual. Suppliers and neighbors and the occasional territorial man. But a hired driver on a spring wagon in that heat meant somebody who did not intend to arrive dusty. She turned and looked over the line. Harlan Ashcroft stepped down. 56 years old. Town suit of gray wool that had no business on that road in August. Watch chain, string tie, a derby hat, and the specific expression of a man who has decided in advance how a conversation is going to go and has allowed for one possible detour. He looked around the yard the way a merchant looks at a room, taking inventory, pricing. Then he saw Hannah at the line. Something crossed his face. She could not tell whether it was surprise or the confirmation of something he had already been told. Miss Mercer, Mr. Ashcroft, is Ward about? I'll let him know you've come. She said it level and she did not move fast, because she was not going to scramble. Because a woman who scurries into a house when a powerful man arrives looks precisely like a woman with something to be scurrying about. She found Ike. Ike found Gideon. Gideon came out with his hat on and his face at its most unreadable, which, Hannah had learned by now, was not blankness, but the opposite. It was the look he wore when he was paying complete attention. Hannah went back to the wash, because it was her work, and walking away from her work because an important man had arrived would have been an admission, and she was not making one. But she could hear. Ward, I'll be direct. Generally the best way. There's talk in town about your new arrangement. I hired a cook and a horse hand. Gideon's voice carried without being raised, which was its own particular skill. If you drove 11 miles in August to tell me there's talk, I'm not certain that's the best use of your Thursday. A pause. Hannah's hands went still on a wet shirt. The woman has a reputation. She does. Hannah's stomach dropped an inch. She has a reputation for making the best biscuits in this valley. Gideon's voice had not changed volume or temperature by a hair, for keeping an honest account of her own work, and for not troubling people who don't trouble her. If that's the reputation you rode out here about, then yes, she has one. Another pause. Longer. You know what I mean. I know what you think you mean. And there it was, the first fractional shift, not louder, just harder underneath. I'm going to ask you to consider more carefully what you're implying, and whether it's a thing you want to have said out loud in my yard. The windmill turned. A horse shifted in the corral. Hannah stood with a clothespin in her mouth and did not breathe. The town is concerned. The town doesn't pay my wages. Ward, Miss Mercer is employed at this outfit in a professional capacity. She's good at the work. She conducts herself with more dignity than most people in this valley manage on a Sunday. A beat. And I've got no further comment on it. She heard Ashcroft say something low. She could not catch it. Then Gideon plain, without heat, and somehow worse for it, Harlan. I've bought stock off you 6 years and I expect I'll buy it 6 more. Don't make that harder than it needs to be. The wagon left 20 minutes later. Hannah pinned up the last of the wash and stood there with the empty basket on her hip and looked down the valley road at the dust hanging in the air. Because he had not defended her, which was the thing she kept turning over and which she could not have explained to anybody. He had not said she's a good woman or she's had a hard time or you ought to be ashamed. He had not asked the town to be kind to her. He had told a man that she was competent and that the subject was closed, which was the only defense in the world she could have accepted without choking on it. When she came in with the basket, Gideon was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and his own ranch book open in front of him, running a column with the end of a pencil. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. After a moment, she set the basket down and went to start supper, because the day continued and the men would be hungry and the world moves along whether or not the right things get said between people. But something had shifted. She could feel it the way you feel the pressure drop before weather comes off the mountains, hours out, when the sky is still, clean. She mended his coat on a Tuesday. Not the ranch coat, the good one. The heavy worked hide he had put over her shoulders in the market road, which had come back from the roundup with a 4-inch tear at the left elbow, where it had caught on a wagon bolt. Ike had brought it to her with the air of a man delivering a summons. He'd have thrown it in the tack shed and forgot it. Then he's a fool with good leather. Yes, ma'am. She did it at the kitchen table, after supper, with the lamp pulled close, because leather that thick wanted a glover's needle and a waxed thread and light you could actually see by. Cross stitch, not running stitch, because a running stitch on hide will pull straight out the first time a man puts an elbow into a gatepost. Gideon came in for the coffee pot and stopped. She held it up. Sit down or don't, but don't hover. You're in my light. He sat down, and then he did not say anything for a while, and she went on working, and the needle went through and drew and went through. Then his hand came out and turned the sleeve slightly toward him, and stopped. Hannah looked up. Something had gone out of his face. Not much, but the particular arrangement he wore, which she had come to think of as a door held closed with a boot, had slipped about an inch. Sarah stitched like that. Hannah's needle stopped. She did not ask. She had learned a long time ago that asking a person outright makes the saying harder, and that the only thing to do is hold still and leave a space open and let them decide whether to walk into it. He turned the sleeve back. Let go of it. My wife, I gathered, crossed, not straight. He was looking at the lamp, not at her. She used to say straight was prettier and crossed was honest. Hannah put the needle down. We came out from Kansas in '72. 2 horses, a plow we never used, and a Dutch oven her mother gave her. He said it evenly in order, like a man reading his own inventory. '73 was the drought. Everything east of here burned up brown by June. I had 31 head and I was going to lose all 31 unless I got new blood in and got it fast, so I went back to Kansas to buy bulls. 3 weeks, round trip, if the trains ran. And while I was gone, the note came due early. Hannah went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. Man who held the paper called it in with 11 days' notice. Sarah could have let it go to default and let me sort it out when I got back. His thumb moved once along the edge of the table. She didn't do that. She hitched the wagon and drove to Tucson herself to ask for an extension. 90 miles. Didn't tell Ike. Didn't tell anybody. Left me a note on the table that said back Thursday. Don't worry. The lamp hissed. She got the extension. That was the part that broke it. That was the part Hannah had not seen coming. She got it. It's in the file. Signed and dated. She won. He stopped. Coming back, she crossed a dry wash about 4 miles this side of the Cañada. It had been dry 11 months. There was rain up on the peaks that morning she couldn't see and couldn't have known about. Hannah did not move. They found the wagon 8 miles downstream. The kitchen sat there and held it. 8 years. Gideon Ward's hands were flat on the table and perfectly steady, which was somehow more terrible than shaking would have been. And every time it rains up on that mountain, I think the same thing, which is that if I'd been home, I'd have been the one driving. And Hannah heard herself answer before she had decided to. My father died in 19 days. His eyes came up. I sat by that bed the whole 19. I fed him. I turned him. I read him the almanac because it was the only thing in the house he hadn't heard twice. Her voice was quiet and completely level. I was there for every hour of it. She looked at him, and I still lie awake some nights certain I did something wrong. Gideon Ward said nothing. Being there doesn't save anybody, Mr. Ward. It only gives you more detail to hold against yourself. The clock in the front room ticked 11 times. He got up, took the coffee pot, stopped in the doorway with his back mostly to her, and she thought he was going to leave, and then he said one more thing, offhand, the way a man drops a stone down a well to hear how deep it is. The man who held that note, what about him? I paid it off in 74, cleared it and never looked at that paper again. A pause of exactly the wrong length. Didn't want to. He did not say a name, but he had stopped. He had stopped for one beat too long. And Hannah Mercer had spent 6 years reading pauses the way other people read weather, and she stood in that kitchen with a glover's needle in her hand and understood that there was something in it. She did not ask, because she had just been given something, and she was not going to spend it in the same hour she got it. The idea came to her on a Thursday morning while she was rendering fat, which was a stupid place for it to arrive, and she never got over that, and years later she still could not smell hot lard without something in her chest going tight. Because she had been turning it for 11 days. Because the missing pages sat in her like a swallowed stone. Because Thatcher had said a man like Silas Thorne can do a great deal of arranging, and it had been rattling in her skull ever since, and because she had been thinking about it wrong. She had been thinking, why did he come for my father? Which was the small question. She set the ladle down. The right question was, why is he good at it? Because nobody is good at a thing they have done once. Hannah took the wagon into Dry Fork that afternoon, without asking anybody, which was her right on any day, and particularly on a Thursday, and she walked up the outside stairs to Elias Thatcher's rented office, with a sheet of paper in her hand that she had written herself at the kitchen table, and she did not knock. She rapped once and went in. Thatcher looked up over the spectacles. Miss Mercer, I have a question and then I have a proposal. He set the pen down. Sit, I'll stand. She put the paper on his desk. In 75, Silas Thorne produced a security document 3 months after my father was buried, backdated, witnessed by people I never met, drawn up by a lawyer in Tucson named Vance. It went through the recorder's office in Dry Fork in under 6 weeks. Nobody stopped it. That is the substance of it. Then answer me this. Hannah put one finger on the desk. Was that the first time he ever did that? Thatcher went very still. Because a man does not invent a scheme like that at 55 years old and execute it clean on his first attempt. She was talking faster now, and she made herself slow down, because she had rehearsed this on 9 miles of road and she was not going to fumble it. The backdating, the witnesses, the choice of a lawyer 2 counties away, the speed of the filing. That is not a first time. That is a procedure. Go on. So if he did it to my father, he did it to somebody else. Because men like that do not think up new methods. They repeat the one that worked. Thatcher took the spectacles off entirely. 1 family is a dispute, Hannah said. 2 families is a pattern. A pattern is fraud. And fraud in territorial land transactions does not belong to a county judge in Tucson. It belongs to the federal land office. The little room was silent except for the scale below. Thatcher sat back in his chair. Where did you read law? I didn't. Hannah's chin came up. I've had 6 years to think about exactly how I lost. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he began to laugh, which she had not expected, a short, dry surprise sound like a cough. Miss Mercer, I have argued in front of the territorial bench 19 times, and I have never once had a client hand me the theory of the case. Then you have had a run of quiet clients. She sat down. Can it be done? Court records are public. He was already reaching for a fresh sheet. Every claim, every filing, every transfer of title. If Bertram Vance's office drew the papers, Bertram Vance's name is on the docket. I can pull every land matter that man has touched in 20 years across both counties and lay them beside yours. How long? 4 weeks. Perhaps I'll have to send to Tucson and to the county seat both, and I'll have to go myself for some of it. Then go. Thatcher's pen stopped. Miss Mercer, I should be plain with you. This will cost considerably more than a single claim contest. Hannah's hands were folded in her lap and they did not move. I have a wage now, she said. I've had a wage for 6 weeks and I've spent $9 of it. Bill me and I will pay it out at the first of every month until it's clear, and if it takes me 9 years I will send you 9 years of envelopes. Thatcher looked at her. Then he wrote it down. The 4 weeks went the way 4 weeks go on an outfit in late summer, which is to say they went at a dead run and left nobody time to be philosophical about anything. The gather started. 14-hour days for the men and 16 for Hannah, because a crew that rides from 4 in the morning eats twice as much and eats it at odd hours, and she was cooking on the outdoor fire half the time and packing dinner out to the north pasture in a wagon the other half. Cassie rode the roan and 2 others, and came in every night with her hands wrecked and her face sunburned, something in her that Hannah had not seen since their father was alive. Because Cassie Mercer had spent 6 years breaking other people's horses for $2 a head in a people's corrals, and now she other people's corrals, and now she had a string and a bunk and a wage that came on the first of the month in full, and men who moved out of her way at the gate because she knew what she was doing. Ike said, on the 3rd week, out of absolutely nowhere, your sister's the best hand with a green horse I ever seen, and I've been at this since '61. Hannah did not say anything for a second. Then tell her that. Told? Toby. Ike. Fine. He told her at supper. Cassie went red to the ears and said something rude and got up and left the table and cried in the barn for 4 minutes and never mentioned it again and did not stop writing better for a month. And in the evenings, after the kitchen was down and the men were out, and the lamp was hers, Hannah did a thing she did not tell anybody about. She copied the ledger. She had bought a blank book in Dry Fork the day she filed. Blue cloth cover, 300 pages, $1.10, which was a great deal of money for a thing that had nothing in it. Every night, 1 hour, sometimes 2, at the kitchen table with both books open and the lamp trimmed low. Her father's hand on the left, hers on the right. Date, entry, amount, in the same order, word for word, including the weather notes and the birthdays and the calf that came bull and stood up on its own. It took her a long time because she would not skip anything. She was not entirely sure why she was doing it, except that a man had put a knife into that book once already, and a thing that has been cut once can be cut again. Except that Thatcher had said the word doubt out loud. Except that she had spent 6 years learning that the only protection a person without money can carry is a record, and that a record which exists in one place does not exist very securely at all. So she wrote. Gideon came through one night at 10:30 and stopped and looked at the books. What's this? Insurance. He looked at it a moment longer. Then he took the lamp off the shelf and set it closer to her elbow without saying anything about it, and went on through, and she heard the page turn in the next room a minute later. The pages came out of her mother's hem on the 2nd Saturday in September. It was not a search. That was the part Hannah never could make sound right afterward, because it made her sound careless, and she had not been careless, she had been busy. She went into the trunk that afternoon for the Tucson promissory note, because Thatcher had written from the county seat, asking for every signed instrument in her father's hand that she could produce. And the note from '69 was the oldest one she had. The trunk smelled of cedar and old wool. She lifted out the letters, the comb, the rolled tintype of her parents that had been made in Tucson in '71 and had gone bad in the developing, so that both their faces were half fog, and the brown dress. She took it out to get at what was under it, and she laid it across her knees, and her hands stopped. because she had held that dress 100 times, and she had never held it in the middle of a summer, when her whole life had turned into a question about documents. The hem was heavy, not heavy the way wool is heavy. Heavy the way a thing is heavy when there is something inside it. Hannah sat on the edge of her bed in a room, with a door that locked, and turned the skirt over and ran her thumb along the fold. And she felt paper. She heard herself make a sound. Some small ugly noise she had no control over. Her hands were not steady, which was a problem, because the stitching was fine, finer than anything Hannah had ever managed. 22 stitches to the inch in a thread dyed to match, laid down by a woman who had been sewing since she was old enough to hold a needle. Her mother's work. Hannah got her scissors. Then she put the scissors down, because you do not take scissors to your mother's hand. She picked at the first stitch with the point of a needle and worked it loose and drew the thread, and it came, and it came, and the hem opened along 4 inches, and then 8, and Hannah Mercer sat on a bed in a ranch house in the Pinaleño foothills and unpicked her dead mother's sewing with the whole of the September afternoon going gold in the window. 3 sheets of paper, folded in quarters, flattened flat by 13 years of wool, cut clean along one edge close to the spine. Hannah could not open them for a moment. Her fingers would not do it. Then they did. The first sheet was a receipt, received of A. Mercer, $25, in part settlement of the note of April last, September 9, 1,874, and in the margin, in a different hand, harder pressed, slanting the other way, 4 letters and a flourish, S. Thorne, his signature, his own hand, on a page acknowledging that Amos Mercer had paid him. Hannah's ears went strange. There was a high thin sound in the room that was not in the room. The second sheet was a list. 4 names, 4 occupations, 4 residences, written out in her father's careful script, with a line at the top that read, "Present at settlement this day." 2 of them she recognized. One was a freighter who had run the Tucson Road for years. One was a man who had shod horses in Dry Fork until 79. The third sheet was not a record. It was 6 lines, written in a hand that was her father's and was not her father's because the letters shook and the pen had gone through the paper twice. "Thorne came today. Says the note was against the land. I told him no. He says he will have a paper that says otherwise. Delia, if you are reading this, don't let him take the creek." A.M. Hannah made it as far as the door frame. Then her legs went out from under. She sat down hard on the floorboards of the hallway with 3 pieces of paper in her hands and made a sound she had never made in her life. Not when her father died, not when her mother died, not on the courthouse steps in April of 75. Because he had known. Because her father had lain in that bed with fever eating him alive, and a man had stood in his own front room and told him what was going to happen, and Amos Mercer had gotten out of that bed and gotten a pen and written it down, with his hand shaking. Because he could not fight, and he could not walk, and he could not do one single thing about it, except leave the truth somewhere. And her mother. Her mother had taken a knife to her husband's ledger while he was still breathing in the next room, and he was still breathing in the next room, and sat down with a needle in the worst winter of her life, and sewed them into the hem of her own dress. Because a book can be taken. Because a house can be searched. Because in 1875 in the Arizona Territory, nobody on God's earth was going to think to look in the skirt of a poor Chiricahua woman. Delia Mercer had died 4 years later without saying one word about it. Don't cut the hem. Cassie found her, came up the hole from the yard with hay on her shirt and stopped dead, and then dropped to her knees on the boards, which Cassie Mercer did for nobody. Hannah held out the 3rd page. Cassie read it. Read it again. Her mouth went out of shape. That's Papa. That's Papa. He knew. Cassie's voice cracked straight down the middle. He knew, and he wrote it, and he never got to. He got to. Hannah's face was wet, and her voice came out of somewhere underneath all of it, steady, almost hard. He got to right here. He just had to wait a while for somebody to come get it. Cassie put her forehead down on her sister's shoulder. They sat on the floor of that hallway for a long time. Then Cassie sat back and wiped her face with the heel of her hand, and said the thing that made Hannah start crying again. Worse. You asked me once what Mama left me. She was looking at the opened hem, at the 4 inches of her own mother's stitching lying loose. That's what. She left me this. She just left it in your trunk because she knew you'd be the one to carry it. Elias Thatcher came back from the county seat on the Monday, and Hannah put the 3 sheets on his desk without a word. He picked up the first one. He read it. Then he stood up, and Elias Thatcher had not stood up once in 6 weeks except to go out a door, and he walked to the window and back. Twice. You have his signature. I have his signature. On a receipt, acknowledging partial settlement of the note. He was holding it in both hands like something that would go off, which means the note existed as a debt of money, which means he was accepting money against it in September of '74, which means that when he produced a document 8 months later, claiming that same note was secured by 160 acres of land, he was accepting cash payment on an instrument he now says was a land pledge. He set it down. Miss Mercer. A man does not take $25 in coin against a mortgage and then claim the mortgage was always for the dirt. Hannah's hands were flat on his desk. And the pattern? Thatcher pulled a folder out of the leather case and opened it, and there was a great deal in it. 5 families. He laid them out one by one, and each one made a small sound on the desk. 19 years. 2 counties. Every one of them handled through the office of Bertram Vance. He turned the top sheet toward her. The Coyle Place, north of the Wash, 80 acres. Widow 61 now. Name of Hattie. Her husband died in '71 and a debt instrument surfaced 4 months later. Doyle. Reeves. A family named Whitcomb out past the county line, and one more where the paper is thin because the family scattered. Hannah looked at the 5 sheets. 5. She had spent 6 years believing she was the only one. She had built a whole architecture inside herself on that belief, a private and lonely and load-bearing wall of it, and Elias Thatcher had just taken it out with 5 pieces of paper. Same shape every time, Thatcher said. A debt document produced after the owner is dead or too sick to speak for himself. Witnesses nobody can find. Filing rushed through before the family organizes. Title changing hands inside 12 months. Will Mrs. Coyle talk to us? Mrs. Coyle. Thatcher's mouth did something dry. Mrs. Coyle has been writing letters to the county recorder once a year for 10 years. She has her husband's account books. She has kept everyone. Hannah closed her eyes for a second. Then it isn't a dispute. No. It's a pattern. It is a pattern. Thatcher was already pulling a clean sheet toward him, and I am no longer writing to Tucson. I am writing to the Commissioner of the General Land Office in Washington, and I am writing it tonight, and I am going to use the word fraud in the first paragraph, which was a Monday. And on Wednesday night, Ike Boone rode into Dry Fork after dark to get a bottle of liniment for a horse with a swollen hock because Toby had run them out, and the horse could not wait until Saturday. He came out of the livery at 9:15 with the bottle in his coat pocket and his own horse on the lead, and he stopped because there was a light on in the back of the Dry Fork Bank, and the Dry Fork Bank had been closed since 3. Ike Boone was 54 years old and had worked cattle since he was 15 and had exactly one talent outside of that, which was standing still in a shadow. He stood still in a shadow. At 9:20 a man came down the side alley and let himself in the back door of the bank with a key that was not the bank's. Silas Thorne, black coat, flat brim. At 9:30 a second man came from the other direction, up from the freight yard, carrying a leather case, in a suit too good for that road. Ike had never seen him before and would not have known him from Adam. At 20:10 the third man came, and Ike treated them with kindness. Knew him from mine, because Ike Boone had bought harness from him for 11 years, and had eaten Christmas dinner in his store 1 year when the snow closed the pass, and had shaken his hand not 4 weeks ago in his own front yard. Harlan Ashcroft went in the back door of the Dry Fork Bank at 20 minutes to 10 at night by a separate entrance. 10 minutes behind a lawyer nobody in that town had ever seen. 20 minutes behind Silas Thorne. Ike stood in that shadow another full minute after the door shut. Then he got on his horse and rode 11 miles in the dark, and he did not go to the bunkhouse. He went to the kitchen door, and Hannah opened it in her nightdress, with a shawl over it and a lamp in her hand, and Ike Boone stood on that step with his hat off and his face the color of dry ash. Get ward. May came into the Mesilla Valley the way it always did, hot before it had any right to be. Dry in a manner that made the cottonwoods along the Rincon look like they were holding their breath. And in the Holt kitchen, a woman who could read 4 languages of arithmetic burned her first loaf of bread so thoroughly that the pan had to be soaked overnight, black on the bottom, raw enough in the middle to still be dough. Ishton stood over it with her hands still floured and waited for Marta to say something about it. Marta only took the pan out of her hands, scraped the worst of it into the hog bucket, set the pan in the wash basin. Fire runs hotter on the left side. Nobody tells you that until they've burned something. You told me. I told you, we both said it and I did it anyway. Knowing a thing and doing a thing. Marta was already setting a second bowl of dough on the table, and the first pan wasn't even in the water yet. Those are cousins, not brothers. The second loaf was better. Not good, better. And that was how the whole of May ran. A woman learning what a farm wife was supposed to already know, one small failure at a time. While Marta Boone stood near enough to catch her before any of it became a real disaster and far enough back to let her feel every mistake land where it belonged. She scorched a pot of beans down to a black crust that took a knife to lift. She hung wash in weather that turned to rain inside the hour and had to carry all of it back in soaked. And Wes had opinions about the shape of the sky that he offered afterward, at length, having offered none beforehand. She did not know that eggs kept better down in the cellar than up in the pantry, and she lost 6 to the first real heat of June and had to say so out loud at supper. Marta never once made her feel foolish for any of it. She corrected the way a woman corrects a niece, plainly, with no weight behind it, and then moved directly to the next thing, which was the mercy in it, because a correction that ends is a correction you can survive. Amos Ketch was a different animal entirely. He said almost nothing to her that first month past what the work required, and what little he did say came clipped and stripped of anything resembling warmth. Move the bay. That gate's dropped. Don't stand behind her. Ishton understood well enough why. He was one of 4 people alive who knew the whole of her circumstance, not the polite arrangement the valley had settled on. Would you treat them with kindness? And a man who had spent 30 years on that ground and watched it come near going under this past year for reasons that had nothing whatever to do with her had earned the right to take his time, deciding what she was. So she did not ask him to be otherwise. She only kept doing her share of the work in front of him, and let him decide, on his own clock, what to make of that. Except one afternoon in the second week, Wes was helping her hang a line and got to talking. Because Wes always got to talking, and he was 19 and had never once in his life successfully held a thing back. Don't take it personal off Amos. I don't. No, but you might, is the thing, because he's got a face like a closed bank. Wes had a mouthful of clothespins and was talking around them. Only he don't hate Apaches. He hates one Apache. Ishton's hand stopped on the wet sheet. Which one? And Wes Tanner heard his own voice arrive at the end of that sentence, about a half-second too late. His face went the color of skim milk. I gotta see about the mare. Wes, she's been off her feed. And he went straight for the barn at a walk that turned into something faster around the corner of the corral, leaving her standing in the yard with a wet sheet in both hands and a hole in the middle of her understanding of the man who would not speak to her. She did not ask Amos. She did not ask Marta either, which surprised her about herself, because there is a kind of information you can only receive from the person it belongs to, and taking it from anybody else is a small theft, and she had been stolen from enough that year to have developed a sensitivity about it. So she put it away, and it sat there for 11 weeks. The ledger was the thing that gave her the first real foothold. She went in for a pen again, which was becoming a pattern she did not care to examine, and once she had the ledger open, she could not quite make herself close it. The columns were a disaster. Figures crossed out and written over. Receipts folded between the pages instead of copied in, some of them from 2 seasons back, one of them a butcher's bill, from a man who had been dead since November. A running total that had been added correctly, and then transferred to the next page wrong, and never caught, and carried forward wrong for 11 months. At her father's camp, the band's accounts with the agency had been kept on 4 sheets of paper she had ruled herself. At the mission, Tull's chapel books had been so neat you could have hung them on a wall. This was neither. This was a man doing arithmetic at 11 o'clock at night, after 14 hours in a field, which was to say a man doing arithmetic, in the one state in which no human being should be permitted to do it. She sat down, and without asking one living soul, she began sorting it into something that made sense. 2 evenings later, Jerry came in from the fields and found her there, with the desk covered in reorganized figures. 6 sheets of foolscap. Every receipt copied in and dated. The 11-month error found and marked in the margin with a small, neat note that read carried forward in error from PED 14, corrected below. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. He looked at the pages a long moment. That's been needing doing for a year. I didn't ask first. I noticed. And something happened at the corner of his mouth that was not a smile but was in the same family as one. Keep going. He did not thank her outright. Not in words. But she began noticing things after that. And the noticing became a kind of second ledger she kept in her head without meaning to. An extra armful of firewood stacked by her door before she had thought to ask for it. A loose board in her floor, fixed without comment, the day after she mentioned in passing to nobody in particular that it creaked. And Marta mentioned once, offhand, in the way she mentioned things that were not offhand at all, that Jerry had given instruction about the well pump, that the bucket was heavier than it looked on a full draw, and there was no call for her to be hauling it when there were 3 men on the place, and that as far as he was concerned, that was the end of the discussion. Ishton had opinions about being decided for. She had a great many opinions about being decided for, having spent February through April being decided for by an entire valley. But she noticed the shape of this one was different, and she could not immediately say how, and it bothered her that she could not. Marta noticed the noticing. Marta noticed everything, and said almost none of it. But Ishton caught her once, setting 2 cups, instead of 3 at the kitchen table on a morning. Wes had gone into town for nails, leaving her and Jerry to share the pot in a silence that was not as empty as it had any business being. You've miscounted. I have. There are 3 of us in this house before noon. Amos takes his in the barn. Marta didn't turn around, has for 30 years. Which was true, which was the maddening part. It happened again the following week with the mending. Marta's hands were full with the wash, and a shirt of Jerry's had come apart at the shoulder seam, and it fell, somehow, to Ishton, who sat across the table from him working the needle while he oiled a bridle. Neither of them talked much. Both of them, if either had thought to notice, entirely comfortable in it. She noticed a week later. He noticed about 10 days after that, and did not know what to do with it, and so did what he did with most things and put it somewhere and shut the lid. Wes, for his part, treated her as though she had always lived there. He tormented Amos without mercy, hid his hat twice, whistled the same 4 bars of a mining song off-key for an entire afternoon, just to watch the old man's jaw tighten by degrees, switched the salt and the sugar in the kitchen, and nearly got his ears boxed by Marta before Amos had even discovered it. And he folded Ishton into the tormenting as easily as if she were a cousin who had been away a while. He asked her nothing about the agency. Nothing about the agency, nothing about February, nothing about the arrangement. It never once occurred to him that there was anything to ask, which was, in its way, the kindest thing anyone did for her that spring, and he did it without the least idea he was doing it. Then came the first Sunday in June. Jer came out to the wagon with his hat brushed and his collar clean, and said it flat, without looking at her, in the voice men use when they have rehearsed a sentence. I'm going into the service. You don't have to. Ishton was already tying her boot. I'm going. Ishton, I said. I'm going. You know what's in that room. I know exactly what's in that room. She straightened up and looked at him. I've known since February. The difference is that in February I stayed home. He held her eyes a second longer than he had ever held them. Then he handed her up onto the wagon seat. The church at Cañada Crucis was frame construction, whitewashed twice, and needing it a third time, with 11 rows of pews and a bell that had come out from St. Louis by freight, and was the town's single point of civic pride. They walked in 8 minutes before the hour, and a row near the front stopped talking. Not all at once. That was the thing about it. It went out in a ripple, one bonnet turning, and then the next, and the talk did not stop so much as flatten out and go somewhere else, and the quality of the air changed the way it does before weather. Mrs. Coleman Vance sat third pew from the front on the aisle. She did not look at Ishton. She moved her skirt. 4 inches, maybe 5. A small gathering in of grey poplin toward her own ankles, the exact motion a woman makes to keep her hem out of a puddle. And the woman beside her did it too. And somebody behind them said something with the word agency in it, pitched at the volume of a whisper and aimed at the volume of a room. Ishton felt her own spine do something without consulting her, because here is what she had planned. She had planned to sit in the back, 3rd row from the rear, by the window, where a person could be present without being an event. She had thought about it for 2 days. She had a whole design. Except Jeremiah Holt did not stop at the back row. He did not stop at the middle. He took her arm, which he had never done, and he walked her the entire length of that aisle, past every turned head in Cañada Crucis, and he stopped at the front pew on the left, the one with the small brass plate on the end that his grandfather had paid for in 1851, and he stood aside so she could go in first. Then he sat down beside her and set his hat on his knee and faced forward. Nobody in that room could see her face for the next 50 minutes. Every last one of them could see the back of her head, and his beside it, and the 4 inches of pew between them, and there was not a single thing any of them could do about it, except look. Ambrose Tull came up to the pulpit and saw the whole arrangement. He saw the front row. He saw the woman he had taught to read sitting in the Holt pew, with her hands folded and her chin level, and he saw Mrs. Vance's skirt, and he saw 11 rows of people, waiting to find out what he was going to say about any of it. He preached on the parable of the sower. 31 minutes on soil. Ishton listened to every word and did not hear one of them, and afterward she could not have told you the text, but she remembered the exact moment she stopped waiting for him to look at her. Because he did not. Not once. Not through the reading. Not through the sermon. Not through the closing hymn, while the whole congregation stood and sang. The man who had put a primer in her hands when she was 11 years old and told her a person who can read cannot be made small, stood in front of a room and preached about ground, and never once let his eyes come down to the front pew on the left. And Ishton thought, standing there with the hymnal open and unread in her hands, he's afraid of something, which was the first true thing anybody understood about Ambrose Tull that year. Outside afterward, the yard filled up the way churchyards do. Men to the wagons. Women in clusters with their backs making walls. Jer went for the team, which took 90 seconds, which was exactly long enough. Coleman Vance came at her from the side of the steps in a black frock coat, with the sun on it, and he did not stand too close, and he did not raise his voice, and he removed his hat. That was what made it terrible. He was, on any observation a bystander could have made, being courteous to a lady, Mrs. Holt. She did not answer. I understand congratulations are still in order. 6 weeks now. 7. He turned his hat once in his hands, and even that he made look considered. I wonder whether you've had occasion to think about the September rolls? I'm not on them. You're not. He smiled with the front of his face. Your father's people are. 83 names. I sign the ration issue for every one of them. Beef, flour, blankets. Every week, my hand on the sheet. The yard went on around them. Somebody laughed by the water trough. It's a considerable responsibility. His voice stayed low and warm and reasonable. Some weeks the freight comes short. Weather. Teamsters. 100 things a man can't control. And then it falls to me to decide who goes without, and how much. I take no pleasure in it. Say the rest. There is no rest, Mrs. Holt. I'm making conversation with a neighbor after divine service. And Ishton stood in that churchyard in her calico, with the red band across her forehead, and understood. completely and finally, that this man was never going to lay a hand on her. He did not need to. He had 83 people and a pen, which meant every winter for the rest of her father's life was a thing this man could adjust like a damper on a stove, and there was no court in the territory she could take that to, and he knew it, and he knew she knew it. She felt something in her chest go very still. Not fear. The other thing. The thing that comes after fear has run out of room. She looked at his hands. You signed them with a pen. Vance's smile did not move. Pens leave marks on paper, Mr. Vance. Ink and a date and a hand that can be recognized every week. For years. She let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. Have you ever once thought about that? For half a second, less, so brief that she could not have sworn to it in front of a magistrate, the color went out from under the skin of his face. Then it came back. You've been well educated. I have. That's a dangerous thing to give a woman. Somebody should have told you that in '74, when you hired me to copy your rolls. And Jerry brought the wagon up. Vance put his hat back on. Wished them both a pleasant Sabbath. Walked to his wife, who had been watching the entire exchange from 30 feet away, with her hands folded in front of her and her face carefully arranged. Ishton got up on the seat without help. They were half a mile out of town before Jerry spoke. What did he want? To remind me of something I already knew, which is that my father eats what he decides my father eats. The wagon went over the wash and the springs complained, and neither of them said anything for another quarter mile. Then Holt said the thing that she thought about for the next 4 months, at odd hours, usually while she was doing something else. He carried that petition out to me on a Tuesday afternoon in October. His eyes stayed on the road. I've been trying to work out for 6 weeks why he'd want my name. Amos asked it in the yard and I've had no answer. But I'll tell you what I've got instead. He didn't come to me because I was important. He came to me because I was hurt. The reins shifted in his hands. That's what he collects. He goes around this valley, and he finds people at the exact worst hour of their lives, and he takes something off them cheap, and they don't notice, because a person in that condition can't. Ishton looked at the side of his face. You think that's what he did in February? To me, I know it's what he did in February. And that was all he said about it. And he did not look over at her once, and Ishton sat on a wagon seat beside a man she had known for 7 weeks, and felt something shift in the room of her chest that she had not given permission to shift. She did not name it. She was not ready to name it. She named it in September, in a barn, in the worst week of her life, and by then it was far too late to do anything about it. Late in June, Amos Ketch stopped going silent when she came into the barn. It was not warmth. Warmth was not in that man's inventory yet and might never be. But the quality of the silence changed. It went from a door closed to a door merely shut. And then one afternoon in the last week of the month, she was standing by the bins with the ledger against her forearm, frowning at a column that did not match what her own eyes were telling her about the grain in front of her. And Amos set down his pitchfork. Long enough to speak. Not long enough to look at her directly. You're counting bushels like they're dollars. Ishton turned. They're not the same animal. Explain it. And he did. Grudgingly. In pieces. With 3 separate stops where he appeared to consider whether he was going to finish. But he explained that a bushel is a measure of volume, and not a measure of value. And that a bushel of grain that has taken damp weighs different from a bushel that hasn't, and that a bin can hold the same bushels in June and October and be worth 2 different sums of money, would you treat them with kindness? And that the number a buyer pays you is a number that lives at the intersection of weight and moisture, and the color of the kernel, and what the man across the counter feels like doing that morning. Which was the first complete set of sentences he had offered her that were not an order or a correction. 11 weeks. Ishton wrote down everything he said, word for word, in the margin of the ledger in a hand small enough to fit, while he was still talking, and she did not permit herself to make it into anything more than what it was. She did that on purpose. She had gotten very good that spring at not permitting herself things, but she wrote it down, and in October, in a room full of the entire town, a piece of what that old man told her in a barn, in June, would come out of her mouth in front of a federal inspector. And Amos Ketch would be sitting in the fourth row with his hat in his lap, and he would not know until she said it that he had been part of it all along. The last day of June, she rode out to her father's camp. She went every week and a half. Jer had never once asked her not to, and had never once asked what was said out there, and had twice put a fresh horse in the corral for her, without mentioning that he'd done it. Her father was thinner. She noticed, and put it down to the season, because there had been a bond express, and the ration freight had come short twice, and because she was 23 years old, and there are things a person's mind will not walk toward until it is pushed. Her cousin walked her out to the horses when she left. "You look different." "I'm eating regular." "That's not what I said." Ishton put her hand on the saddle horn and did not get up. "He's not what they said he was. Nobody is." Her cousin was watching her closely. "That's not an answer either." And Ishton stood there in the flat June light with 22 miles between her and Trand, a house she had not chosen, and said something she had not planned to say, and did not entirely know she thought until it was out. "I don't need anybody in that valley to believe me. I need one sheet of paper that tells the truth louder than his mouth." Her cousin's eyebrows went up. "And where's that paper?" "In his office." "Ishton. I copied his rolls for 6 months. I know what's in the ledger and I know what came off the wagons, and those two numbers were never the same number, not 1 week in 24. She swung up. "I know where he keeps it. I know which drawer. I know he doesn't lock it because who out there can read it? You'd be a thief. I'd be a copyist." She gathered the reins. "There's a difference, and I intend to make the whole territory learn it." And she rode home. She did not tell her husband, which was a decision, and it was hers to make, under the terms he had set out himself in that front room in April, and she would come to think of it later as the first brick in a wall that neither of them saw going up. She started the copying in July. Not the agency ledger. Not yet. She started with her own head, because 6 months of a thing lives in a person's memory in fragments, and the fragments go if you don't catch them. Every night after the lamp went out in the kitchen, in the east room, with the shutter half open for what air there was, she wrote down what she could recall. Dates, beef issue in pounds, flour in sacks, the names of the 2 teamsters. The week in December when the wagon came in with 11 sacks, and the sheet went out saying 19, and she had written the 19 herself because she was a clerk and clerks copy what they are handed. That was the night she quit. She had never told anybody that, including her father. She wrote it down anyway, because the whole point of the exercise was that a person's own shame belongs in the record too, or the record isn't worth anything. 22 months, she got most of it. She hid the sheets folded flat in the bottom of her clothes, chest, under a winter shawl, and she thought, more than once, about the cedar box in the desk drawer 8 feet away and about how this house was becoming a house where 2 people kept paper they could not talk about. In the second week of July, she made a suggestion at supper. It came out of nothing. Would you treat them with kindness? It came out of a conversation about the wheat and how it was standing and whether the heads were filling, and she said it in the middle of passing a dish, which was the only way she had found to say things in that house, without the whole table turning into a hearing. When it comes in, don't sell all of it at once. Amos stopped chewing. We hold the best of it back. Bin it separate. Don't commit the whole crop to the first buyer that weighs a wagon. Wes looked at Jerry. Jerry looked at his plate. That's not how it's done. Amos went back to his food. You cut, you haul, you sell. You don't sit on grain and hope. I'm not talking about hoping. Then what are you talking about? I'm talking about a man who buys grain and also signs government paper. She set the dish down. 1 man, 2 offices. And every single thing we own passes across a counter he stands behind. The kitchen went quiet. Amos Ketch waved his hand. Just that. A short, flat motion, about 6 inches, the gesture a man makes to move smoke out of his face. And he went back to his supper and said nothing else on the subject that night or any night after. Ishton let it go. Would you treat them with kindness? She had learned by July that arguing with that man in the moment accomplished nothing whatever, and she had also learned that he was the only person on that place who ever changed his mind about anything, and that when he did it in private and told nobody. She did not know that July. Which of those two things was going to matter? The other letter went out the same week. She wrote it at the desk in the small office with the door open, in her best hand on paper Jerry had bought for accounts, and she addressed it to a grain commission house on the levee at St. Louis, whose name she had gotten off the back of a freight bill from 2 seasons back that had been folded in the ledger pages the whole time. She did not ask for money. She did not ask for a favor. She asked whether the house would be so kind as to send, at her expense if there was one, a printed copy of the rules of inspection and grading used by the merchants' exchange of that city for wheat received by rail. Because that was the thing she had worked out in June and had been turning over ever since. That a grade was not a man's opinion. That somewhere there was a printed sheet that said what a number 2 was and what a number 4 was, in words, with tolerances, and that if such a sheet existed, then a buyer's judgment was not a verdict. It was a claim, and a claim could be checked. She did not tell Jer about that letter either. She told herself it was because there was no point raising a thing that might come to nothing, which was true, and which was also the exact reasoning her husband used about every important thing in his life, and she would have been furious to have it pointed out to her. The last week of July, she came back from the horses after dark and saw a light still burning in the barn. She had not expected it. Amos banked the lamps at 9. She went to the door and did not go in. Jer was at the far bench with his sleeves rolled and his vest off, planing a length of cedar into a curve, sawdust pale against his boots. A second piece already shaped, laid across 2 sawhorses. Whatever it was going to be, it had arms. He worked slower than the job required, running his thumb along an edge that was already smooth and then going back over it anyway. She did not ask what it was for. Would you treat them with kindness? She had a fair guess, and something about the quiet, careful way he was going at it told her that this was not a thing he meant to be asked about yet, and that asking would take it away from him. She went on to the house without a word, and she lay awake for a while afterward and thought about a man who could not say a thing out loud, and so said it in Cedar instead, and she thought about the fact that she was not much better, with a stack of copied numbers folded under a shawl in a chest 11 feet from where he slept. 2 people in one house, both of them building something in the dark and telling nobody. The rider came up the ruts at 9 the next morning. Agency man, not Vance. Would you treat them with kindness? A clerk with a satchel and a horse that had been ridden too fast in July, which told Ishton before he was off the saddle that whatever was in the satchel had been sent in a hurry by somebody who wanted it to arrive before it could be answered. 2 documents. The first was a notice from the Office of Indian Affairs, Cañada Agency, advising that the removal of the Chiricahua band to San Carlos, previously scheduled for the first week of September, had been advanced to the 12th of August. 19 days. The second was worse. It was a memorandum, addressed to no one in particular, in the way that the most dangerous paper always is, noting that a question had been raised concerning the validity of the marriage of one Ishton, Chiricahua, to Jeremiah Holt, freeholder, and that the exemption claimed thereunder was placed under review pending inquiry, and that pending said review the said Ishton's name would be retained upon the removal schedule. Signed at the bottom, C. Vance, Special Agent. Jer read it twice. He did not swear. He did not crumple it. He read it a second time all the way through, which Ishton would think about later, because a man who reads a thing twice under those circumstances is a man who is looking for the seam. Wes was talking. Something about riding to town. Amos told him to be quiet. There's no ground for a review. Ishton's voice came out of her steadier than she felt. The license is legal. Tull signed it. Mata and Amos witnessed it. There's no ground. There doesn't have to be ground. Jerry folded the memorandum along the crease it came with. There has to be a review. A review takes time. And on the 12th of August a wagon comes, and the review is still open, and you're on a list. And a list is a thing a man with a rifle can read. The yard was silent. That's the whole trick. He was looking at the paper and not at anybody. He doesn't have to beat us. He only has to be slow. Then he handed the memorandum to Ishton and walked into the house. She thought he had gone to the office for the strong box. He had. But he did not come out with money. He came out with the cedar box under his arm, and he walked past all 4 of them into the middle of the yard, and he set it down on the dirt and opened the lid. The comb. The gloves. He took those 2 things out and set them on the ground beside him with a care that made Marta turn away. Then he took out the folded sheet of foolscap with 31 signatures on it. Jerry. He did not look up. He struck a match off his boot heel and touched it to the corner and held it while it caught, and the October of 1877 went up in his hand in about 11 seconds in a July morning with no wind at all, and he dropped the last of it and put his boot on the ash. Ishton stood 4 feet away. I thought you kept it to remember. I remember. He put the comb back in the box, the gloves after it. Now I need the room in the drawer for something else. And he reached into his vest and took out the marriage license, 7 weeks folded and refolded and gone soft along the creases, and laid it flat in the bottom of that cedar box on top of a dead woman's gloves, and shut the lid. Nobody said anything. Amos Ketch turned and walked into the barn. Wes stood with his hat in his hands, looking at the black smear on the dirt, and Marta Boone, who had watched 3 funerals come out of that house and had opinions about all of them, put her apron up to her face for exactly 2 seconds, and then put it back down and went in to see to the stove. Ishton stayed in the yard. Her husband was already crossing toward the barn, because there were 19 days and a wheat crop between them and August, and because that was what he did with everything. She looked at the ash, and she thought about the chest in the east room with the copytized in the east room with the copied numbers folded under a winter shawl, and about the letter riding east towards St. Louis on the mail contract, and about a man in a black coat who had just told an entire family, in writing, exactly how little he needed the truth in order to win. She had been in that valley her whole life. She had been in that house 11 weeks, and standing there over a burnt petition in a farmyard in July, Ishton Holt understood that the arrangement her father had made in April was finished. Whatever this was now, it was not that. Nobody had signed anything, and nobody had said a word out loud, and it had changed anyway, the way ground changes under a house, slowly, and then all at once when you notice. 19 days. She went inside and took the shawl out of the chest and counted the sheets. 61. It was not enough. She was going to have to go and get the rest. The hail came on the 29th of July with no warning past a wind that turned strange and a sky that went the color of a bruise an hour before dark. Ishton was at the kitchen window when it started. She counted. Not because anybody asked her to. Because you treat them with kindness. Because her hands needed something, and the clock on the shelf was the only thing in the room that was still behaving normally. And so she stood there and watched the second hand and watched the yard go white and did the arithmetic she did with everything. 11 minutes. 11 minutes of the sound of 1,000 men throwing gravel at a roof. Jez came out of the office partway through and went for the door. Marta got there first. She put her hand flat on his chest and left it there, 54 years old and a foot shorter than him, and she did not push. There's nothing out there to save while it's still falling. He stopped. Because she was right, and you treat them with kindness, and because arguing with Marta Boone had never once gone well for anyone in that house, including his father, who had tried it in 1863 and referenced the experience for the next 20 years. Wes had his hat on and his hand on the latch, and Amos took him by the back of the collar without appearing to move much at all. So the 4 of them stood in a kitchen and listened to a year's work get taken apart in the dark. Nobody spoke. There is nothing to say during 11 minutes like that. Every sentence a person could reach for is either a lie or a wound, and the 4 people in that room knew each other well enough by July to skip both. It stopped the way it started, all at once, and then the strangest silence any of them had ever heard, a valley with no insects in it, no wind, no dogs, nothing, because everything that had a voice had been beaten quiet. They went out at first light. The damage was not everywhere. Hail rarely falls even. It comes down in ribbons, and it takes what it takes and skips the rest, for no reason a man can look at afterward and understand, which is somehow worse than losing all of it. Where it had struck, the wheat lay flattened and broken-stalked in wide, ragged patches, heads knocked loose into the mud, 40 acres looking like something had been dragged across it. Where it hadn't, the crop stood up gold and untouched with the water still on it. Jer walked the rows with his jaw set and said almost nothing. Amos knelt in the middle of the worst of it, took a stalk between two fingers, bent it, let it go, said even less. Wes paced off the damaged ground in long strides to get a rough figure of the acreage, gone, and came back with a number and gave it, and nobody answered him, and he stood there holding it like a boy who has brought a dead bird to the table. They did not try to save all of it. Amos made that call inside the hour, standing in the mud with his hat in his hand, and it was the only time that summer he spoke to Jerry the way a man speaks to another man's father. Cut what'll still take a blade. Today, before the next rain gets in the broken ones and rots them standing, and the worst of it we let go. That's 12 acres we walk away from. That's 12 acres already gone, boy. You're not deciding whether to lose them. You're deciding whether to lose them, and the 4 days it'd cost to try. There is no arguing that kind of arithmetic once it has been said out loud. Ishton did not go out among the broken stalks. She had thought about it. She had stood at the edge of the yard in the gray light and looked at it and understood, in about 4 seconds, that there was nothing she could do out there that would not be a performance. So she did what she could actually do. She carried water and cold biscuits out to the men working past noon and past 2 and past 4. She kept a running count of which wagon came in from which section. In a small book she ruled herself, so that the sound grain and the damaged grain would not get mixed in the bins and drag the whole crop down to the level of its worst part. And that night, at the kitchen table by lamplight, with the ledger open and her own book beside it, and Amos's June marginalia in her own small hand along the edge of page 19, she refigured what the lost acreage meant against what they still owed. It took her until 2 in the morning. She did it twice, because a number that bad ought to be checked. The number came out the same both times. She brought it to Jerry in the office at 2:30 with the lamp guttering, and she did not soften it. That's short. It is. How short? With a fair price and a fair grade, and a full crop, we'd have come inside the note with about $90 to spare. She set the sheet down and put her finger on the line. Take out 12 acres, and it's $411 short. That's assuming last year's price. It won't be last year's price. No. Say the rest. Ishton looked at him. The rest is that I don't know what the price is going to be, and neither do you. And there's exactly one man in this valley who does, because he's the one who'll be saying it. Jer sat back. The lamp went down to almost nothing, and he turned it up without looking at it. You didn't round that. No. Every man I've ever borrowed from rounded. I'm not borrowing from you. And that was the first time in 11 weeks that Jeremiah Holt laughed out loud. One short flat sound with no comedy in it whatsoever, at 2:30 in the morning, over a number that was going to cost him his farm. Harvest came 3 weeks later, and with it the second blow, and it had nothing to do with weather. The price of wheat that year had fallen hard. Not slid. Fallen. Down to less than 2/3 of what it had brought the season before, which was the season Jerry had borrowed against when he took on the extra acreage, back when the numbers had looked like they would hold. They did not hold. Nobody's did. Every freeholder in the Mesilla Valley opened the same news that August, and did the same arithmetic in the same kitchens. And when Jerry hauled the first wagon load in to the grain office on Merchant Row, Coleman Vance weighed it himself. Would you treat them with kindness? Came out from behind the counter in his shirt sleeves for the occasion, which was theater, and everybody in the room knew it. Ran his hand down through a sample, let it fall. Picked up a few kernels and bit one. Number 4. Wes, who had ridden in on the wagon and had been told twice to keep his mouth shut, made a noise. That's number 2 wheat, Mr. Tanner. You can see it's number 2. Look at the color on it. There's not a shrunk kernel in the whole Wes. Jerry said it once and the boys stopped. Vance wrote the ticket slow, enjoying the pen. Test weights light. Moisture's high off that rain you had. I make it a 4, and I'd make it a 4 for any man in this county. Which was, and this was the elegance of the thing, not provably false. Because there was no printed standard in that office. There was no scale a farmer could appeal to. There was a man with a hand and an eye and a ledger, and 140 freeholders who had been taking his word for 11 years because there had never been anything else to take. Jerry looked at the ticket. Number 4, at 61 cents, against a note that wanted $1,100 in October. He did not argue. He gave one short nod, took his receipt, folded it into his vest, and drove home with his jaw set in the particular way that Ishton, by then, had learned to recognize from 100 yards off. He did not speak the whole way. Wes tried twice and gave it up. Ishton was on the porch when the wagon came up, and she read the whole thing off the two of them before it stopped rolling. She took the receipt out of his hand, looked at it, and then she went into the office and did not come out until the lamp was lit. It took her 3 evenings. 3 evenings hunched over that desk with the ledger open, and Amos's bin figures beside it, and her own damage count book, and the thing that had come in on the mail contract 8 days after she wrote for it. A printed pamphlet. 31 pages, stitched with a St. Louis printer's mark on the back cover. Rules of inspection and grading adopted by the Merchants Exchange. She had read it 4 times already. She read it a 5th, and somewhere in the middle of the 3rd evening she stopped writing and sat back and understood. A grade was not a verdict. A grade was a description, and the description was printed, and it had been printed for years, and it said in plain English what separated a 2 from a 3 and a 3 from a 4. Test weight in pounds to the bushel. Kernel condition. Foreign matter allowed by percentage. Damage by percentage. Sound plump, well cleaned. And each of those words meant a number, and every number was on a page in front of her that any literate person on earth could hold up. Which meant Coleman Vance had not made a judgment. He had made a claim, and a claim can be checked. She sat there with the lamp and the sound of the house settling and did the whole thing again on paper. 61 cents on a number 4, 94 cents on a number 2, 940 bushels off the sound sections, plus the damage that would grade low no matter who looked at it, and she ran it out to the bottom of the sheet and drew her line. It did not clear the note. She checked that twice too, because she wanted it to, and wanting is exactly when a person's arithmetic goes soft. It did not clear it. But it came near enough that a bank looking at the 2 columns would see something it had not seen before, which was a farm that could pay most of what it owed this year, and all of what it owed next. And no bank in the territory forecloses on that, if it can help it, because a foreclosed farm in a falling market is a stone in a man's pocket. She found Jerry in the barn at 10 at night, with a lamp and a lame mare. "I need you to come look at something." "In the morning." "No." He looked up. She put the ledger on the bench between them and opened the pamphlet on top of it and put her finger on the line. "Read that." He read it. Now read what he wrote on your ticket. He did, and Ishton Holt watched her husband's face do something she had never seen it do, which was change in front of her without being ordered to. He graded it. He claimed it. She turned the page. "There's a difference, and this book is the difference. Test weight 58 pounds is a 2. Ours came off the scale at 59 1/4 on the first wagon. It's on his own ticket. He wrote the weight himself and then wrote a 4 under it. Those 2 numbers can't both be true. He's the buyer, he's a buyer, he's the only one in Cañada Cruces, which is not the same thing. And I have been sitting in this house for 4 months watching everybody in this valley behave as though it were. There's no other buyer inside 60 miles. Then we go past 60 miles. Jer put both hands on the bench. With what money? With no money. She shut the book. We don't need my father to pay this debt. We need somebody else to look at the wheat. That was the sentence. She did not know, when she said it, that it was the sentence, and she did not remember saying it afterward in exactly those words, but Jerry did, and 11 months later he could still say it back to her verbatim. And he brought it out at odd moments for the rest of their lives, the way a man brings out a stone he picked up somewhere important. She wrote to her father that night. Not for money. Would you treat them with kindness? She was very clear with herself about that, sitting at the desk at 11 with the pen going, because there had been a moment in the 3rd evening where she had let herself imagine asking, and had not liked what she saw in herself when she did. She asked for a name. 22 years. Her father had corresponded with merchants and freighters and missionmen and Indian traders across 3 counties, and he had never once asked a favor of any of them, and a debt that has never been called is worth a great deal more than one that has. The answer came back inside the week by a rider from the camp. One name, a commission merchant at Doña Ana who had bought and shipped for the mission station for 9 years, who had a set of certified scales because his freight contracts required them, who owed Datso of the Chiricahua exactly nothing except the kind of goodwill a man does not forget. He came out on the 2nd of September. He did not take Vance's ticket. He did not take Jerry's word. He did not take the pamphlet. He took his own sample, out of 3 separate bins with his own probe, and he ran it over his own scale off the back of his own wagon, and it took 11 minutes. Then he confirmed, standing in the barn with the dust hanging in the light, exactly what Ishton had worked out on paper, in a house 22 miles from anywhere, 59.5 to the bushel. Sound, plump, well cleaned. That's a number 2 by any exchange rule printed in this country, and I'll put my hand to it in writing. Wes let out a whoop, and Amos told him to shut his mouth in a voice that had a great deal less conviction in it than usual. And then Amos Ketch, 61 years old, cleared his throat. There's more. Everybody turned. 3rd bin, north wall, the one I've had the boards up on. Jer looked at him. That's seed grain. That's not seed grain. Amos would not look at Ishton and did not look at her for the entire duration of what he said next, which was about 9 sentences and was the longest consecutive speech anyone on that place had ever heard out of him. Back in June she said, hold the best of it separate. Don't commit the whole crop to the first man that weighs a wagon. And I waved it off at supper in front of everybody, because I've been doing this since before she was born, and I didn't care to be told my business by a woman in my own barn. He put his hat back on. Then I went out and did it anyway. The barn was completely silent. Cut the north 40 first, before the hail even. That's the ground that fills best and always has. Binned it separate. Kept it out of the first load. I've had the boards up so nobody'd shovel it by accident. He finally looked at her. 2 seconds. Maybe 3. 220 bushels. It'll grade better than anything else on this place. Ishton did not say anything. She could not have. Because a man had heard her in June and dismissed her in front of the whole table, and then walked out into the dark and acted on her word, and had said nothing about it for 11 weeks, and there is no thanks that fits inside that, and she knew better than to try to build one. She nodded once. He nodded once. And that was the entire transaction, and both of them understood it completely. The merchant graded the north bin at a number 2, high side, and wrote the whole thing out in a fair hand and signed it and dated it and left a copy. It closed most of the remaining gap. Not all of it. Most of it. Jer Holt rode into Cañada Cruces on the 4th of September with a certified grading in his vest pocket and a competing offer written under it, and he swallowed more pride in the next 40 minutes than he had in the whole of the past year, and none of it went the way anyone at that breakfast table had imagined. Because he did not go to the bank first. He went to Vance, which he had decided on the road, and which he did not tell anybody afterward that he had decided, and which was the single worst decision Jeremiah Holt made in his entire life. He told himself it was courtesy. He told himself a man gives the buyer he's dealt with 11 years the chance to meet a price before he takes his crop elsewhere. That was true. Would you treat them with kindness? It was also true that he wanted to stand in front of Coleman Vance and put a piece of paper on the counter and to watch what happened in the man's face. And there was nothing in that wanting that had anything to do with courtesy at all. Ishton rode in with him. She had business at the mercantile, or said she did. She sat in the wagon outside the grain office with the reins loose in her hands and the shade of the awning coming just to the horse's ears. The window was open. That mattered later. Everything about that afternoon came down to a window being open in September, in a town where every window was open in September. Jose put the grading certificate on the counter. Vance read it without touching it. Doña Ana, that's right. Certified scales. Well, he straightened up. A man's entitled to a second opinion. It's not an opinion. It's a test weight and a printed rule. You've been reading. Somebody in my house has. And there it was, the half-second again. The thing Ishton had seen in the churchyard in June, the color going out from under the skin and then coming back. What is it you want, Holt? 92 cents on 940, 94 on the north bin. Or I haul the whole crop to Doña Ana and you can explain to the exchange why the wheat that left this county at a 4 arrived at a 2. Vance was quiet a moment. Then he did something nobody expected. He laughed. Not the front of the face smile. An actual laugh, short and genuinely amused. The laugh of a man watching a dog work very hard at a trick. You think this is about wheat? It's a grain office. Sit down. I'll stand. Suit yourself. Vance came around the counter, and he did not go near him, and he leaned back against it with his arms folded entirely at his ease. Let me tell you what you don't know, and then let me make you an offer, and then let me tell you how long you have. He nodded at the certificate. That's fine work. Genuinely. If this were a grain matter, you'd have beaten me with it, and I'd have shaken your hand. Except your note isn't at the territorial anymore. Out in the wagon, Ishton's hands went still on the reins. Hobart Finn sold that paper in November. Cash on the barrel. He had the right, and he took it, and he did not think 1 minute about what he was selling. Because Hobart has never thought 1 minute about anything in his life, and that's why he's a banker in a town of 600 people. Who holds it? I do. The word went across that counter and landed. $1,106, payable the 1st of October. And here is the part you'll want to attend to. He unfolded his arms. I don't want it paid. Everybody wants a note paid. I want the creek. And Coleman Vance, 46 years old, in his shirt sleeves in a grain office on a September afternoon, told a man exactly what he was out loud because he had decided he had already won. The railroad's at Las Vegas now. It'll be through this basin inside 3 years, and every acre in the Mesilla is going to be worth 4 times what any of you fools think it is. And the acres that matter are the ones with year-round water. And there are 3 of those, and yours is the middle one. That's all this has ever been. The petition, the rolls, February, all of it. I have been assembling a valley for 11 years, 1 hurt man at a time, and you are the last parcel. Jer did not move. So here's my offer, and I'd have you hear all of it before you say anything. Say it. Petition for annulment, fraud in the inducement, misrepresentation of character, take your pick. Would you treat them with kindness? Any circuit judge in this territory will grant 80 minutes to a white freeholder who says he was deceived about what he was marrying. You state you did not know who she was. You state her father misrepresented her. That's the whole document. It's 4 paragraphs. My clerk can draw it tomorrow. Silence, and I will tear that note in half in front of you. On this counter, you keep the land. You keep the water. Your old man keeps his bunk, and your cook keeps her kitchen, and that boy keeps whatever it is that boy does. $1,100, gone for 4 paragraphs. He let it sit. You lose exactly one thing, and it's a thing you never chose. The clock on the wall of that office made a sound. Jer Holt did not answer. He stood at the counter with his hat in his hand and the grading certificate on the wood in front of him, and he did not say one word, because here is what was happening inside him, and no one on earth could see it. Say no. Say it right now. Say it before he finishes breathing, because if you take 1 second on this, he will think you took a second, and he will be right. You did. Except if you say it in this room, you will say it with your hands, and there is a man's face 9 feet away, and you have wanted to open that face since the last morning of April. And then you're a man who assaulted a federal agent in a grain office. And then there's no crop and no bank and no argument and no wife. Because they don't leave her with a man in the Doña Ana jail, they put her on the wagon on the 12th, and there is nobody left standing to stop it. So don't open your mouth. Don't open your mouth until you can open it flat. Which took 11 seconds. 11 seconds of a man standing perfectly still in a grain office in Cañada Cruces, saying nothing, while a clock ticked. And out in the wagon, through an open window, in the shade of an awning, his wife heard every single one of them. She heard the offer. She heard the 4 paragraphs and the note torn in half and the thing he never chose. And then she heard nothing. 11 seconds of nothing. Then Vance's voice again, comfortable, unhurried. the voice of a man who has read a silence and liked what it said. Take your time. Talk to your people. I'll want an answer inside 3 days. 3 days. Ishton sat on that wagon seat, with the reins in her hands, and something went through her chest like cold water, going into a boot. 3 days. The exact number. The same number her father had ridden home with, in April, and she had sat at a fire that night and been told that a man had asked for 3 days to decide whether he would take her, and she had said yes to it, and she had spent 4 months building a life on top of that answer. And now the same man had been offered 3 days to give her back, and he had not said no. Jerry came out inside a minute. He put the certificate in his vest. He got up on the wagon. He picked up the reins out of her hands and turned the team and drove. She looked at him. Well, he's got the note, I heard. His hands did not change on the reins. Then you know where we stand, do I? And that was it. That was the moment. And it lasted about a second and a half. And if Jeremiah Holt had said 11 words in it, the next month of both their lives would have been entirely different. Tell her. Tell her he wants the creek, and tell her what he offered, and tell her you'd sooner burn the house. Except then she carries it. Then she sits at that table for 3 days, knowing a man put a price on her, and knowing the price was cheap, and she'll do arithmetic on it, because that is what she does with everything, and she will work out to the dollar what her own annulment was worth, and she will never once stop knowing that number. Don't hand her that. Handle it. Handle it, and tell her after, when it's dead. So he said nothing, and he drove his wife 22 miles home in the September heat, believing, with his whole chest, that he was protecting her. It was the same thing he had done in February of 1877. He did not see it. Marta saw it inside a day. Ishton lasted 40 hours. She spent them the way she spent everything, which was working, and the working was the tell, because she did not stop. She did the wash out of turn. She scrubbed the pantry shelves that had been scrubbed in July. She went through the ledger and copied out 3 pages that did not need copying. Jera was in the fields or the barn or the office. Twice she came to a doorway, and he was writing and put his forearm over the page, which he had never done in 4 months. He's drawing it. No. Stop. He's doing accounts, with his arm over it. He is doing accounts, and you are a woman who has been sold once already this year, and you are seeing it in every shadow in this house. Except he hasn't said 1 word to me in 2 days. He never says words. He said them in April. At supper the second night, Wes asked whether they were hauling to Doña Ana or not, and Jerry said it wasn't settled. Ishton put her fork down. What isn't settled? The haul. The haul is arithmetic. Would you treat them with kindness? There's a certificate in your vest and a merchant with scales in Doña Ana and a note due the 1st of October, and there's nothing in any of that isn't settled, unless something else got said in that office that I don't know about. Marta stood up and started clearing plates that were not finished. Amos looked at Jerry. Jerry looked at his food. It'll be settled tomorrow. And Ishton Holt sat at that table in a house she nuanced and understood that the terms had changed and nobody had told her. She went out to the barn at 10 to see about her horse, and Marta followed her with a lamp and did not pretend to have another reason. He's not doing what you think. You don't know what I think. I've known that man since he was 4 days old. The lamp came down onto the bench. I know exactly what you think, because I thought it too for a day and a half, and I was wrong. And I'll tell you how I know I was wrong. He's not eating. Men don't eat when they're deciding. Men don't eat when they've already decided and can't get out of it. Marta's voice went hard in a way Ishton had never heard from her. You want to be careful here, both of you. He's got a sickness about this, and I've watched it kill people in this family before. Then say the name of it. He thinks silence is a kindness. Ishton stood there in the barn with her hand on the stall rail, and she almost went in. She almost walked back into that house and put it in front of him and made him say it. And if she had, the whole of what followed would not have followed. Except she was 23, and she had been given away in April by a father who loved her, and she had spent 7 months being discussed in rooms she was not in, and she had exactly one thing left in the world that had not been decided for her. She could leave. He had told her so himself in April, standing in his own front room with his hat in his hands. The third morning she was up before 4. She left the ledger on the kitchen table, open to the page with the last figure she had worked, the one that closed the gap, the arithmetic that would save that farm whether she was standing in it or not. And in pencil in the margin, in the small clean hand that Ambrose Tull had spent 6 years putting into her, she wrote, "This is yours, not mine. I was never given the choice to walk in. Walking out is the one I've got." She took the 61 folded sheets from under the winter shawl. She left the license in the cedar box. She rode out with the sky still black over the organ range, and she did not look back at the house, not once, and she would think about that particular decision for the rest of her life without ever being able to say whether she regretted it. Marta found it at 5:30. She read it standing up, once, and then she carried the ledger into the office where Jerry was already at the desk with a lamp burning down and papers in front of him, and she did not hand it to him gently. She put it on top of what he was writing. "Marta, read it." He read it, and Marta Boone watched the color go out of a man she had known 31 years. "Where?" "Her father's camp, I'd expect, unless she's got better sense." He was already up. "She's been gone an hour and a half at the outside." Marta did not move out of the doorway. "You'll catch her or you won't. But before you go out that door, I'm going to say one thing to you, and then I'll never say it again. Say it fast. You've done this before?" He stopped. "February of 77. That girl asked you at the kitchen table on the Tuesday night whether you were frightened, and you told her no. And you were. You were out of your mind with it. I watched you saddle in the dark and I saw your hands. And you told her no, because you thought it would keep her calm." The room was very quiet. She died on the Thursday believing her husband wasn't worried. Marta stepped aside. "You've been doing it ever since, and you've never once called it what it is." He went past her, and what he found at the desk on the floor when he swept the papers off it in his hurry, and what he had been writing under his forearm for 3 days, was a petition of his own, not for annulment. 9 pages in a cramped hand, addressed to the Office of Indian Affairs and to the Surveyor General of the Territory, laying out a ration agency and a grain house held by one man, and a banknote sold in November and a creek, and every date he could prove. It was not finished. It had never been finished, because he could not prove the one thing at the center of it, and he had spent 3 nights hunting for the piece and had not found it. He left it on the floor and rode. She reached the camp at 11. She got there in time to see the wagons. 3 of them, agency stock, with an escort of 6 under a lieutenant from Fort Selden, who did not want to be there and whose face said so, and a clerk with the schedules. And the 12th of August moved up again, and now standing at the 9th of September because a review had concluded and nobody had been informed. Her name was on the list. Because a woman who leaves her husband's land is a woman not residing under the roof of a landholding citizen, and the exemption is a residency exemption, and it says so in the 11th line. And Coleman Vance had known that on the morning of the 4th of September, when he offered a man 3 days, he had not needed the annulment. He had needed her to go. Ishton came off the horse into a camp of 83 people with bundles at their feet, and her father came out to meet her. Datso walked 6 steps and stopped, and then went down on one knee in the dirt, with one hand out to catch himself, and coughed and kept coughing. And when he took his hand away from his mouth, there was blood across the palm of it, and down the front of a shirt he had put on clean that morning. The whole camp went still. Ishton was on the ground beside him without knowing how she got there. How long? He could not answer yet. How long? Since February. She looked at him. February. The doctor at the mission said a year. His voice came out wrecked, and he steadied it because he had spent 30 years steadying it in front of people. That was in February, before I came to you at the fire, before I rode to Holt. And Ishton Holt sat in the dirt of her father's camp, with her hand on his back, and understood, all at once, every single thing about April. You knew. I knew. You knew, and you didn't tell me, and you handed me to a man in the dark like a debt you were settling before you died. Yes, he said it flat. He did not soften it, and he did not decorate it, and he did not offer her the version she could have lived with more or easily. I told myself I did it for you. And that is true. And I want you to hear that it is true because it is. His breath came shallow. Would you treat them with kindness, that I could not stand the thought of going into the ground and leaving you in a valley full of wolves with no name on you that they were obliged to respect? I could not bear it. Not for you. For me. I did not want to die frightened. The wagons creaked behind them. I have asked myself every night since April which of those weighed more. I have never once come up with the answer, and I have stopped expecting to. Ishton's eyes were streaming, and her voice was not. You took the choice out of my hands. I did. Say it again. I took it out of your hands. Datsof of the Chiricahua looked up at his daughter with blood on his shirt front and the clerk's schedule 50 feet away. So I am giving it back now. In front of everyone. You go where you want to go and you stay where you want to stay. And whatever it is, I will not say one word about it. Not one. For whatever is left. He got a hand on her wrist. That is all I have left to give you, and it is the only thing I ever should have given you in the first place. Holt rode into that camp at 4 in the afternoon. He had ridden, with kindness, he had ridden the 22 miles in a little under 3 hours on a horse that would not be right again for a month, and he came in past the wagons and past the lieutenant, and he got down and took off his hat. He asked to see his wife. The answer came back through her cousin, and the cousin did not enjoy delivering it. She would not see him. So he stood there, outside the ring of brush shelters in the open, with his hat in both hands and the whole camp, watching a white freeholder stand in the sun like a fence post for a reason none of them could work out. He stood there 4 hours. He did not sit. He did not go to the shade. Twice a woman brought him water, and both times he thanked her and drank it and went back to standing. The light went off the organs. The lieutenant's men made a fire. And at 8 o'clock at night, in the full dark, Jeremiah Holt put his hat on and got up on a spent horse and rode out. Not west. Wes was on the corral rail when the sound came up the road and he was off it before he had decided to be. That's him. Amos did not move. That's not the west road. He's come round from the north cut. Where's he going? The horse went past the gate without slowing, and the man on it did not look at the house. And Wes Tanner stood in his own yard at 9:30 at night, with his mouth open, watching a set of hoofbeats go up the Jornada Road toward Las Cruces and the north. Amos. Where's he going? Amos Ketch took the pipe out of his mouth. Santa Fe. What in God's name is in Santa Fe? And the old man watched the dust go pale under a rising moon on a road he had ridden 100 times and would not ride again. The thing 31 men in this valley should have done 2 years ago. Santa Fe took 10 days. Not because the ride was long. Because a man who walks into a territorial office with 9 unfinished pages and a grievance learns very quickly that the government of the United States is a building full of people who each hold one small door and none of them hold the one you want. He slept 4 of those nights in a livery loft. He spent the rest standing in corridors, and on the 6th day a clerk in the Surveyor General's office looked at his pages for the 3rd time, and finally said the thing that unlocked it. You've written a complaint about a grain buyer. I've written a complaint about a federal agent. You've written both, in one document, which is why every man in this building has handed it back to you. The clerk turned the pages around. Split it. The grain matter goes nowhere. There's no law in this territory that makes a bad grade a crime. But a special agent of Indian Affairs, holding a commercial interest in the same county he issues rations in, that's not a complaint, Mr. Holt. That's a violation of the regulations of the Interior Department, and there's a man in this town whose entire employment is riding out to look at things like that. Jer Holt stood very still in that corridor. Say that again. Which part? The part where somebody comes and looks. So it went in on the 16th of September, as 2 documents instead of 1, and 11 days later a special agent of the Interior Department, named Whitfield Rennick, 51 years old, gray, unimpressed by everything, boarded the stage at Santa Fe with instructions to convene a public inquiry at Cañadas Cruces into the conduct of the ration agency. Public, because the territory had no courthouse in that town, and the schoolhouse was the only room that held 60 people. Public, Because Rennick had been doing this 11 years, and had learned that a man will lie to an inspector in an office and will not lie to an inspector in front of his neighbors. Public, because Jeremiah Holt had asked for it in writing, in the 9th paragraph, and had not told one living soul that he had. He came home on the 28th of September. The wheat was still in the bins. Amos had held it. Nobody had hauled a wagon anywhere. Doña Ana takes it Thursday. Jerry was off the horse and already walking. All of it. The north bin last, separate ticket. And the note. The note's due Tuesday. Amos followed him. Then you're 4 days short and $1,100 in a hole. I'm aware. You'd better be more than aware, boy, because a man in this county gets 1 grace day off a bank, and you have already spent it in a livery stable in Santa Fe. Jerry stopped at the porch and turned around. Vance isn't going to foreclose on Tuesday. Why in hell not? Because on Tuesday, he's going to be sitting in a schoolhouse, trying to keep his commission. Ishton did not know about any of it. She had spent those same 10 days moving 83 people twice. Because the lieutenant from Fort Selden had an order dated the 9th, and a countermand dated the 11th, and a second order dated the 15th, and nobody in the United States Army was prepared to tell an old man with blood on his shirt which piece of paper was real. The wagons sat. The band stayed. And Ishton Holt, who had ridden out of a marriage with 61 folded sheets under her arm, sat by a fire on the 4th night and counted them again, and got the same answer she had gotten in July. Not enough. 61 sheets of a thing she remembered, which was not evidence, which was a woman's recollection, and a woman's recollection in that territory was worth precisely nothing against a federal agent's ledger, and she had known that when she wrote them and had written them anyway, because a person has to start somewhere. Except the ledger existed, except she knew which drawer. Except she had sat at that desk 6 months, and had watched Coleman Vance lock the strongbox every night of his life, and had watched him never once lock the ration book. Would you treat them with kindness? Because the ration book was not money, and because there was nobody in 40 miles who could read it and hurt him with it. Nobody except the woman he had hired to copy it. Her cousin caught her saddling at 11 at night. Where? The agency. Ishton. 3 nights. Maybe 4. There's 22 months in that book, and I can do about 6 months a night if the lamp holds, and when he walks in, he doesn't sleep there. He sleeps at his house in town with his wife, and the clerk goes home at 6, and there is one window at the back with a sash that has not shut properly since the spring of '75. Her cousin stood in the dark and looked at her. You've thought about this for a while. I've thought about this since February. Ishton pulled the cinch. The difference is that in February, I thought about it as a woman who'd been ruined. Now I'm thinking about it as a clerk who was underpaid. She went in 3 nights running. She copied 22 months of ration issue in a small, clean hand by the light of a lamp, turned down to a bead, and she put beside each entry the second number, the one that came off the freight bills in the same drawer, because Vance had been careless in exactly one way, and it was the way careless men are always careless. He kept both books in the same place, the book that said what the government sent, and the book that said what the wagons carried. Beef issue on the sheet, beef received off the contractor, flour issued, flour received, week after week after week for 22 months, and the 2 columns never matched, and they did not match by an amount that was remarkably consistent. 38%, 39, 37. A man stealing 4 in every 10, and doing it steadily enough that it looked like weather. And on the 3rd night at 2 in the morning, in the bottom of the same drawer, she found something she had not gone in for, a bundle of promissory notes, 11 of them. Purchased assignments kindness. Purchased every, bought off the Territorial Bank at Cañada Cruces between 1874 and the autumn of 1878, all of them against freeholds in the Mesilla Valley, and she turned them over one at a time and read the dates and the names and felt the floor tilt, because she knew these names. She had read every one of them out loud in a farmyard in May. Kittredge, Pike, Bonner, Alvarado, 11 of the 31 men who had signed a petition in October of 1877, and under the notes, folded flat, a single sheet in a different hand entirely, a certification. I hereby certify that the foregoing signatures were subscribed in my presence. Ambrose Tull, dated the 9th of October, 1877. Except the petition Jerry Holt had burned in his own yard in July, had 31 names on it, and Ambrose Tull had never in his life been in a room with 31 freeholders at once, and the certification said in my presence, and there was one line of it in a hand that shook. Ishton sat on the floor of that office at 2 in the morning with a lamp turned down to nothing, and understood that she was not holding evidence of a theft, she was holding the mechanism. A petition gets a mission preacher's certification. The certification makes it official. The official petition creates a removal threat. The removal threat frightens a valley. A frightened valley sells cheap. And the man who bought the notes off the bank is the same man who carried the petition around to be signed, and the preacher who certified it signed because the same man held the paper on his chapel. 11 years, one hurt man at a time. She rode for the mission station at first light. Ambrose Tull opened the door of the schoolroom where he had taught her to read, 60 years old, in his shirt sleeves, and saw who it was and did not say good morning. He said the other thing. The thing he had been carrying since the 11th of April when he entered a marriage on a line of a register above his own name. "You've found it." Ishton did not answer. "I have been waiting 2 years for somebody to find it, and I told myself that if it was anybody it would be you." His hand was still on the door frame. "Because I taught you to read, which is the one good thing I have done in 11 years in this valley, and I did it before I knew what it would cost me." "Why?" He held the note on the chapel. "That's a reason, it isn't why." And Ambrose Tull, who had stood in front of a congregation every Sunday for 30 years, looked at the woman he had taught his letters to and gave her the true answer, which was worse. "Because I did not read it." Silence in that doorway. He brought it to me with the signatures already on it and said it was a memorial about grazing, and I did not read it. And I signed a certification saying they had subscribed in my presence when not one of them had. And by the time I understood what I had certified, there were men in this valley who had already sold, and I could not undo it. And every Sunday since then, I have climbed up in front of those same men and told them to do what is right. His voice broke on the last of it, and he did not try to fix it. I have preached 94 sermons since I signed that paper. I counted. I sat down last spring and I counted them, and I could not tell you one thing I said in any of them. Ishton stood in the doorway of the room where she was 11 years old once. "Then come with me. I'll be ruined, yes." He looked at her. "You will be ruined." Her voice did not rise and it did not soften. "And you'll be ruined by your own hand and not by his. And that's the only kind of ruin a man gets to keep." The inquiry opened at 10 in the morning on the 6th of October in the schoolhouse at Cañada Crucis. And by 9:30 there was not a seat left in it, and men were standing 4 deep along the back wall. Whitfield Rennick sat at the teacher's table with a docket and 2 clerks. Coleman Vance sat in the front row, on the right in a black frock coat, with his hat on his knee and his wife beside him, and he looked like a man attending a christening. Because he was not worried, because he had been through 3 of these in 11 years, twice in Arizona and once at Fort Stanton. And every one of them had come down to a hostile accounting, and an accounting is a thing you win by having better paper than the other fellow, and he had the best paper in the county. Jerry Holt sat on the left with Amos Ketch beside him, and Marta beside Amos and Wes Tanner at the end of the row, and Wes could not keep his knee still, and Amos put a hand on it twice. Rennick opened with the grain matter, because it was the smaller thing, and inspectors always eat the smaller thing first. Jerry put the Doña Ana certificate on the table, and the printed pamphlet with it. Vance was on his feet inside of a minute, entirely relaxed. "Sir, I'd only observe that grading is a matter of professional judgment, and that reasonable men differ, and that the Doña Ana house has an obvious interest in." "Sit down, Mr. Vance." "Sir," I said, "sit down." Rennick had the pamphlet open and did not look up. 58 pounds to the bushel is a number 2. That's not my opinion, and it's not yours. That's printed on page 4 of a rule book that has been in use in this country for 11 years, and this certificate says 59 and a half. and your own ticket says 59 and a quarter, and then your own hand wrote a 4 under it. He turned the ticket over. A standard is not a matter of judgment. Your judgment is the thing standards were invented to survive. Somebody in the back of that room laughed. One man. A short bark of it cut off fast. And it was the first time in 11 years that anyone in Cañada Cruces had laughed at Coleman Vance, and every single person in that schoolhouse heard it happen. The color came up out of his collar and did not go back down. Rennick moved to the agency accounts at 11, and that was where it should have died. Because the agency accounts were Vance's own book, kept in Vance's own hand, and it Vance's own hand. It balanced perfectly, and it had balanced perfectly for 22 months, and he brought it forward himself and opened it on the table and invited the inspector to take all the time he wanted. Rennick took 40 minutes. The room got warm, and men started fanning themselves with hats. Mr. Holt, your complaint alleges a shortfall in issue. This book shows none. That book shows what was written down. Do you have anything that shows what was carried? And Jeremiah Holt, who had ridden to Santa Fe and back with 9 pages and a hole in the middle of them, had to stand up in a room of 60 people and say the word. No. Vance's shoulders came down about an inch. Then I'm bound to tell you that the grain matter stands and the agency matter does not. Rennick closed the book. A recollection is not a record. Unless there is some other. The schoolhouse door opened. She came in out of the 10 o'clock light with the dust of 22 miles on her boots, in a blue calico skirt and the red band across her forehead, and she had not put on a bonnet, and she had not left the band at home, and she had made no attempt whatsoever to walk into that room as anything other than what she was. Under her arm, a bundle of paper 4 inches thick. The room made a sound like a held breath let go. Amos Ketch stood up before he knew he was doing it, and then realized he was the only man standing, and sat back down very fast. Sir, I have what was carried. Rennick looked at her over the top of his spectacles. And who are you? My name is Ishton Holt. I was the copyist at the Cañada Agency office from August of '74 until February of this year at $11 a month, paid in scrip. She set the bundle on the table. Mr. Vance hired me himself. He'll confirm it. Vance was standing again. Sir, this woman is my complainant's wife, and was she your clerk? Sir, was she your clerk, Mr. Vance? It's a short question, because he could not say no, because there were 4 men with kindness. Because there were 4 men in that room who had walked into that office and seen her at that desk, and one of them was the freight contractor. Would you treat them? And Coleman Vance had spent 11 years building a reputation as a man whose word could be checked, and it was now the rope around his own neck. She was employed there. Then let's have it. And Ishton Holt turned around and spoke to a room, instead of to a table, which nobody had told her to do, and which no witness in that territory had ever done. And she did it because she had spent 7 months being talked about in rooms she was not in, and she was never going to do that again as long as she lived. For 22 months, this agency drew rations for 211 persons. She opened the top sheet. For 22 months, 83 persons received the portion of 128. I have the issue book copied entire. I have the freight receipts copied entire. They are in the same drawer of the same desk, and they have never once agreed. And they disagree by 38%. Steady, month on month, for 104 weeks. The room had gone completely silent. Every sheet is dated. Every sheet is signed. He signed them. She let that stand. Then she turned and looked at the man in the front row. Mr. Vance told this town I was his woman. Nobody moved. He never said it himself. He is far too careful for that. He let it be said, and he let it be repeated, and he let it stand for 8 months, because a woman with that said about her is a woman nobody will believe about anything. And it worked. It worked completely. There is not one person sitting in this room who did not hear it and decide something. Mrs. Coleman Vance was looking at the floor. He was right about all of it but one thing. She turned back to the inspector. He paid me for 6 months to copy his books, and he forgot that I can read. Rennick took the top sheet, then the second. Then he sent a clerk out to the agency office with a note, and the room sat in the heat for 19 minutes without a word said in it. And when the clerk came back, he was carrying 2 books, and his face had gone the color of paste. And Ambrose Tull stood up in the 4th row, 60 years old, shaking so badly that he had to put one hand on the pew ahead of him. "Sir, before you go on, there is a certification I gave in October of 77, and I have come to say what it is worth." He was not ruined gracefully. Nobody is. He said it badly, and he said it twice, and at one point he had to stop entirely for the better part of a minute. And the whole town watched a preacher take himself apart in the room where he had married half of them, but he said all of it. The petition he did not read. The chapel note. The 11 assignments bought off Hobart Finn at 80 cents on the dollar from men who were frightened, and the 9th of October, and subscribed in my presence, when there had never been more than 2 men in that room at once, and one of them had been Coleman Vance with a pen. Hobart Finn was called at 4 and confirmed the sales in a voice nobody could hear past the 3rd row. Rennick suspended Coleman Vance from the office of special agent at 20 minutes past 5 that afternoon, sealed the agency books, and directed that he be conveyed to Santa Fe in the custody of a deputy United States Marshal to answer before the department. There was no shouting. That was the thing that surprised everybody afterward. He simply stood up and put on his hat and walked out of the schoolhouse between 2 men, past 100 people he had spent 11 years dressing up for, and not one of them said anything at all. And when Ishton Holt came down from the front of that room, the first person on his feet was Amos Ketch, 61 years old, hat in his fist, standing up straight in the 4th row. Then Marta. Then Wes, who whooped and was told to hush by 4 people at once, and did not. Then Ambrose Tull, who was already standing and had nothing left to lose by it. And then, slower, in a rustle of poplin and calico that went along the rows the way weather goes across a field, the women, including the 3rd pew on the aisle. Mrs. Coleman Vance got to her feet in a schoolhouse in Cañada Cruces on the 6th of October and stood there with her chin up and did not look once toward the door her husband had gone out of. The banknote came back to the territorial inside a month. It came back because a suspended agent has no business holding commercial paper in the county he was suspended from, and because Hobart Finn, who had spent his whole life not thinking about anything, thought about one thing very hard that autumn and repurchased 11 assignments at a loss that took him 4 years to work off. The Doña Ana house took the crop at 92 and the North Bin at 95. It did not clear the note. It came inside $110 of it, and Finn granted the extension without being asked, standing in his own doorway with his hat off, which was as close to an apology as that man was constitutionally able to get. The railroad turned north out of Rincon in the spring of 1881 and never came through the basin at all, and every acre Coleman Vance had assembled in 11 years went to nothing in about 9 months, and he was gone out of the territory before the 2nd summer. That was the whole of his punishment. He was never tried. The department took his commission and the courts never got him, because the courts in that territory did not get men like him. He simply stopped mattering, which was, for a man built the way he was built, considerably worse. They stood in the yard that night, the 6th of October, with the wagon still hitched and neither of them moving to unhitch it. He gave me 3 days. Ishton did not turn around. To petition an annulment. Fraud in the inducement. 4 paragraphs and he'd have torn the note in half on that counter. I heard him. I know you did. I worked that out about 2 hours after you were gone, and I have not had a comfortable minute since. You didn't answer him. No. You stood there for 11 seconds. I counted the same as you did. Jer Holt put his hand on the wagon rail and left it there. You thought I was deciding. Yes. I was not deciding. He said it flat and did not decorate it. Would you treat them with kindness? I was standing in that office working out that if I opened my mouth in that room I would put it him through the window. And then I'd be in the Doña Ana jail, and there's no crop, no bank, no argument, and nobody at all left standing between you and a wagon on the 12th. Ishton turned around. Then say that. I know. Say that, Jerry. In the wagon. On the road. Any one of the 40 miles we drove after. I know. Instead, you drove me home in the heat and let me sit in that house for 2 days with my own arithmetic, and I am very good at arithmetic. Her voice was not steady now, and she let it not be. So I worked out what I was worth to you. To the dollar. 1106. He shut his eyes. Marta told me something the morning you went. I can guess. Ada asked me on the Tuesday night whether I was frightened. His hand had gone white on the rail, and I told her no. And I was out of my head with it. I said no, because I thought a frightened woman does worse in a fever. And I have got 100 reasons like that lined up in a row, and every one of them is a good reason. And she died on the Thursday, believing her husband wasn't worried about her. The wind moved through the yard. I have not said a frightening thing out loud to a person I loved since February of '77. Not once. I told myself that was carrying it for them. He opened his eyes. It isn't. It's putting them outside the house and locking the door and calling it shelter. Ishton stood in the dark and did not go to him. Then say the thing you actually want to say. Not the confession. The other one, Holt, took his hat off. Stay. She waited. Not because of any arrangement your father made in April. Not because of a list or a paper or a creek. Because I'm asking. I'll stay. Her voice came out low and entirely certain, which surprised her more than it surprised him. I'd already meant to. I turned the horse around on the north cut, and then I turned it back, because I was not going to walk into this house on a day when you were the one who'd won something. Neither of them said anything grander than that. It did not seem to need it. They brought Datso to the East Room in November. Jerry drove out and got him himself on the buckboard with 3 wool blankets and went at a walking pace the entire 22 miles, because every rut in that road took something out of the old man that he did not have to give. He lasted into January. He had good weeks in there. That was the part Ishton kept afterward. 2 good weeks in early December where he sat in the sun on the south side of the barn and taught Wes Tanner to plait a 4-strand rein Chiricahua fashion. And Wes was terrible at it, catastrophically terrible. And the old man made him do it 11 times and laughed at him out loud on the 8th. Amos would come and stand at the corner of the barn and watch that and not say anything, and then go away again. The porch conversation happened on the 2nd Sunday of December, cold enough to see their breath. I'll ask you one time, and I'd rather you took a moment than gave me something quick. Jerry waited. Do you love her? Not the arrangement. Her. He was quiet long enough that the old man nearly regretted asking so bluntly. I do. Datso turned his head. I didn't expect to. Last April, if you'd told me that on my own steps, I'd not have believed you, and I'd have thought less of you for saying it, if the answer had been otherwise. Datso pulled the blanket up. I want you to know I would not have pressed you to keep pretending. I'd have taken her out of here myself. Whatever this town chose to say about it, I'd have carried that. I know you would. On my hands and knees if it came to it. I know. Jer looked out at the dark fields. That's not what I want, though. I want us to stay what we've become, not what we started as. And then something in his face moved before the words came, and they came out awkward in a way that suited him better than smoothness ever had. Sir. Datso waited. Father, if you'll allow it. The old man did not say anything for a moment. When he did, his voice was not entirely steady. I'll allow it. Would you treat them with kindness? He died on the 11th of January with his daughter's hand in his and the whole band camped in the near field, and they buried him on the eastern rise where a man can see the length of the valley. Jer had the parcel surveyed off and deeded to the band in perpetuity. 3 witnesses, recorded at Las Cruces, not assignable and not saleable, which cost him 40 acres of his best grazing and $112 in fees he did not have. Amos Ketch dug the grave. He would not let anybody help him. It took him 2 days, and he was 61 years old, and the ground was frozen, the first 11 inches, and on the second afternoon Wes went out with a second spade and Amos looked at him and Wes came back. The snow came down past the fence line by the end of December and stayed. The house drew in the way it always did that time of year. Amos barked his shin on the same cedar chair in the front hallway every single evening for 6 weeks and complained about it every single time and never once moved it out of his way himself. Because Holt had never said what it was for. He had planed it and sanded it and fitted the arms and rubbed oil into the grain of it through July and August. And then he had carried it into the hall in November and set it down and gone out to the barn, and nobody had asked, and it had simply become a thing in the hallway that Amos hit his leg on. Ishton woke one night in the second week of January with the bed cold beside her. She got up. There was a sound coming from the front room. Not words. A low, uneven hum, tuneless, going nowhere, the sound a man makes when he is not aware he is making it. She stood in the doorway and did not go in. Jer was moving in slow half-circles in the dark with one hand resting on the back of the cedar chair, turning it a little, letting it rock and catching it, the way a person does with something they built and have not yet handed over. In his other hand was a letter. She could see the seal on it, even in that light. It had come from Santa Fe in December, and it had sat on the office desk for 4 weeks, and she had watched him pick it up 11 times and put it down 11 times. He was talking to it. Not loudly, not in sentences she could catch. He was treat them. He was standing in his own front room at 2 in the morning practicing out loud the thing he could not get out of his mouth in daylight, and she understood, watching him, that this was how he had been doing it his whole life. Go in. No. Go in and take it out of his hand and read it and be done. And then it's mine. And then he never learns to hand me anything again. He learns that if he waits long enough, I'll come and take it. Except he's 40 feet from the room where his father died, and he is standing in the dark, talking to a chair. Let him have it. One more night. She went back to bed. He handed it to her at breakfast without a word. And it was the department's disposition of the agency accounts. And it was fine. And it had been fine the whole time, and he had not been able to open it for 4 weeks, because he had gotten one letter out of Santa Fe in his life that mattered, and he had never opened that one either. Marta had. Snow gave way to mud by the last week of March, and mud gave way, in the 3rd week of April, to ground dry enough to work. Jer Holt walked the same fields he had walked a year before, turning the same soil for the season's new crop. Very little else about the walking felt the same. The ceremony came the last Sunday in May. Not a wedding. Both of them were quite firm about that with anyone who asked, and a good many people asked. They were married. That had been settled in a front room in April of 1879 in under 10 minutes, with a boy holding his hat by the door, and it was not in question, and never had been. This was the other thing. This was a day of her own to remember, because she had never had one. Ishton wore a pale green poplin with nothing practical about it whatsoever, chosen for no reason on this earth except that she liked the way it moved, and over it, across her forehead, her mother's red band, which she had worn every day of her life and did not take off for this, and would not have taken off for anything. She did not trade one for the other. That was the whole point, and every woman standing in that yard understood it. Ambrose Tull performed it. He had lost the mission station in November. The chapel note went to the territorial with the rest, and the board at Santa Fe declined to renew his appointment, and he was living that spring in 2 rooms over the harness shop at Cañada Cruces, teaching letters to anybody who came, which was 11 people and growing. He read slowly. His voice did not shake once, and had not shaken since the 6th of October, and he would tell people for the rest of his life that a man does not get his voice back by being forgiven, but by finally saying the thing out loud in a room where it costs him. 19 people from the band stood on the right half of the yard. Something past 40 from the town stood on the left. Nobody drew that line and nobody mentioned it, and by the middle of the afternoon it was not there anymore. And afterward not one person present could say exactly when it had gone. Marta Boone cried through the entire thing, without apologizing to anybody for it. Would you treat them with kindness? Wes Tanner whooped loud enough to startle the horses in the barn, took an elbow from Amos Ketch, that did not stop him whooping again a minute later, and spent the rest of the day telling the story of the schoolhouse to anyone who would stand still, in a version that grew considerably. And Amos himself, when the moment came, clapped louder and longer than any man standing in that yard, which surprised nobody who had been paying attention since August, and surprised Amos Ketch least of all. Afterward, with the crowd scattered across the yard and the light going long, Jerry found her standing at the edge of the new planted field, looking out at the first thin lines of green only just showing above the soil. He came and stood beside her. He did not say anything grand. He did not need to, by then. She took his hand and put it flat against her middle. "You told me a year ago you don't promise what you're not certain you can keep." "I did. Promise now." Holt looked out at that field for a long moment. "I'll be here." She waited. Not 3 days. Not 3 years. And he stayed exactly where he was, with his hand where she had put it, while the wind came down off the fields carrying the smell of rain that had not fallen yet. Behind them, in the hallway of that house, somebody finally moved the cedar chair. Nobody saw who. It was not in the way of the front door anymore the next morning. And Amos Ketch walked the length of that hall 3 times that week without once barking his shin, and never said one word about it to anybody as long as he lived.